Hello everyone, I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The call came at 4:47 p.m. on a Tuesday, just as autumn's early darkness began creeping across the suburbs. My van's dashboard clock glowed amber in the failing light, and I remember thinking how odd it was that someone would wait until near sunset to report an electrical emergency. The voice on the phone had been peculiar, not panicked, as most customers were when their power failed, but resigned, exhausted, like someone who'd been treading water for hours and had finally accepted they might drown. "Nothing works after dark," the man had said, his words careful and measured. "No lights, no flashlights. Even candles won't stay lit. We need someone before the sun sets completely." I'd laughed, assured him it was probably just a tripped breaker or faulty wiring. These old Victorian houses on Elmwood Avenue were notorious for their antiquated electrical systems. I told him I'd be there within 20 minutes. The house squatted at the end of the street like something that had been vomited up from the earth rather than built upon it. 3 stories of weather-beaten gray siding and black shutters, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean away from it, as if repelled. The porch light was on, still daylight after all, but even from the street I could sense something wrong about how the bulb flickered, like it was struggling against an invisible weight. The owner met me at the door before I could knock. He was perhaps 60, thin to the point of gauntness, with eyes that reminded me of coal mines, dark, hollow, leading down to places light had never touched. His handshake was cold and brief. "You'll want to work quickly," he said, glancing at the horizon where the sun bled orange through the trees. "Once it sets, you won't be able to see anything. Nothing will work." I hefted my tool bag and followed him inside, professional smile fixed in place despite the crawling sensation along my spine. The foyer was dim even with the overhead chandelier blazing. The light seemed to stop a few inches from the bulbs, as if the air itself was too thick to carry it properly. "How long has this been happening?" I asked, running my hand along the wall, feeling for the telltale warmth of overloaded wiring. 3 weeks. Started gradually. Lights would dim after sunset, then take longer to turn on. Now, he gestured helplessly at the shadows gathering in the corners despite every light in the house being on. Now darkness comes whether we want it or not. I pulled out my voltage tester, watching the digital display flicker uncertainly. The readings were normal, yet something made my teeth ache, like biting down on aluminum foil. The air tasted metallic, charged with potential that had nowhere to go. "I'll check the breaker box first," I said, trying to ignore how my voice seemed to be swallowed by the walls, emerging smaller and thinner than when it left my throat. He led me to the basement door, and I descended into what felt like a throat made of rotting wood and crumbling concrete. Each step down seemed to take me further from the fading daylight above. My flashlight beam, still working as the sun hadn't fully set, carved through darkness that felt almost solid, resistant. The breaker box was modern, recently installed from the look of it. Everything appeared normal, but as I examined the connections, I noticed something that made my hands still. Behind the panel, where the main line fed in from outside, the wall was wrong. The concrete had patterns in it, swirling designs that hurt to look at directly, as if someone had pressed their nightmares into the foundation while it was still wet. I traced the patterns with my flashlight, and they seemed to pulse, to breathe, drawing my light into them like lungs taking in air. The beam grew dimmer the longer I held it there, and I jerked it away with a gasp I didn't realize I'd been holding. Above me, I heard the owner pacing, his footsteps quick and nervous. The basement windows showed the last sliver of sun disappearing behind the neighboring houses. My flashlight flickered once, twice, then died. The darkness that rushed in wasn't empty. It had weight, texture, an almost liquid quality that pressed against my skin like cold oil. I fumbled for my phone, pressed the flashlight function. Nothing. The screen was on. I could feel its warmth, but no light emerged from it. It was as if the photons themselves were being devoured the moment they were born. I tried to speak, to call out to the owner, but my voice came out as barely a whisper, the sound eaten before it could travel. The darkness pressed closer, and I felt something that wasn't quite hearing, wasn't quite touch. More like the memory of a sensation, broadcasting directly into my brain. Hungry. So hungry. Years of feeding on candle flames and lamp oil, decades of nibbling on electric current, and still the hunger grows. I stumbled backward, hands outstretched, finding the stairs by pure instinct and muscle memory. Each step up felt like climbing through thick tar. The darkness followed, or perhaps I was simply moving through it. It was impossible to tell where I ended and it began. At the top of the stairs, I burst through the door into more darkness. Complete, absolute, darker than closed eyes, darker than the space between stars. But I could sense the owner nearby, hear his breathing, rapid and shallow. "It's feeding," he whispered, and his voice came from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Every night it grows stronger. Started with just the lights, but now it takes more. The warmth from our bodies, the color from our memories, the hope from our hearts." I tried to move toward where I thought the front door should be, but direction had lost meaning. Up and down felt interchangeable. The floor beneath my feet might have been the ceiling. I couldn't tell anymore. The darkness wasn't just absence of light. It was presence of something else, something that had been waiting in this house for God knows how long, growing fat on whatever illumination dared to enter after sunset. My hands found a wall, followed it, searching for a door, a window, anything. The surface felt wrong. Soft in places like flesh, hard in others, like bone. Sometimes it pulsed with a rhythm that might have been my own heartbeat or something else's entirely. "Stay," the not voice suggested in my head. "Stop fighting. Stop burning energy. Rest in the dark where nothing can hurt you because nothing can find you. Even you cannot find yourself." For a moment, just a moment, it seemed like the most logical thing in the world. Why did we need light anyway? Why did we fear the dark? Here, wrapped in absolute blackness, there were no responsibilities, no failures, no disappointed customers or unpaid bills. Just the eternal hungry night. Then my hand found the doorknob. Cold metal, real and solid. I turned it, pulled, and tumbled out onto the porch where the streetlights, blessed, beautiful streetlights, pushed back the autumn evening. I fell to my knees, gasping, drinking in the light like a drowning man gulps air. Behind me, the owner stood in the doorway, half in shadow, half in light. His face was peaceful, almost serene. "You felt it," he said. It wasn't a question. "You understand now." I scrambled to my feet, backing away toward my van. "You need to leave that house, tonight. Don't go back in there." He smiled, and I noticed how thin he'd become, how his skin seemed translucent in the streetlight, like paper held up to a flame. Where would I go? It's in me now. Has been for weeks. When you starve long enough in the dark, you start to become the dark. Besides, he glanced back into the house. My family is still in there. Only then did I see them. Shadows moving behind windows. Vague shapes that might have been people, or might have been the darkness itself playing at being human. How many were in there? How long had they been feeding that thing with their presence, their warmth, their light? I got in my van and drove away, leaving my tools, leaving my invoice, leaving whatever was happening in that house behind. But even now, weeks later, I can feel it. The darkness that touched me, that tasted me. Every night when I turn off the lights to sleep, I wonder if the darkness in my room is the same darkness everyone else experiences, or if I brought some of it back with me. Last night, my bedside lamp took 3 tries to turn on. The night before it was 2. This morning, I noticed my reflection in the bathroom mirror seemed dimmer somehow, like someone had turned down my opacity settings. I've started leaving lights on constantly. Every room, every hallway. My electrical bill is astronomical, but I don't care, because I know what waits in the darkness now. Not death. That would be too simple, too merciful. What waits is the slow consumption of everything that makes you yourself, pulled away photon by photon, thought by thought, until you're just another shadow in a house that no light can penetrate. Sometimes, late at night, I think about calling that house, warning whoever might answer. But then I remember the owner's peaceful smile, the way he stood so comfortably with half his body in absolute darkness, and I realize something that makes my hands shake. He never gave me his address. I found that house on my own, drawn there by something I still don't understand. And sometimes, when I check my GPS history, the route shows me driving to different addresses, houses I've never been to, streets I don't recognize. The destination changes every time I look, which means either the house moves, or there's more than one. Or, and this is the thought that keeps me awake, surrounded by every light I own, the darkness doesn't need a house at all. Maybe it just needs someone who's tasted it, someone who carries a piece of it inside them, spreading it wherever they go. My lamp just flickered, just once. But once is how it always starts. The sun is setting now as I write this, and despite every light in my apartment blazing, the shadows in the corners seem deeper than they should be. They pulse with a rhythm I recognize, a hunger I understand all too well. I tell myself it's just my imagination. I tell myself the darkness is just darkness. But when I look at my hands on the keyboard, I swear they're slightly translucent, and the light from my monitor seems to pass right through them, as if I'm becoming less solid, less real, with every passing moment. Maybe that's what the house really devours, not light but the ability to exist in it. Maybe we don't disappear into the darkness. Maybe we become it. Story 2. The first time I noticed something was wrong, I was standing perfectly still in the kitchen, waiting for my coffee to brew. My shadow, cast long and dark across the checkered linoleum by the morning sun, moved. Just a slight shift, the shadow's hand reaching upward while mine remained at my side. I blinked hard, attributing it to exhaustion from the move. 3 weeks in this old Victorian house, and I was still adjusting to its creaks and groans, its particular way of settling in the night. My wife noticed it next, though she laughed it off with that nervous titter she gets when something genuinely unsettles her. She'd been folding laundry in the living room when her shadow stood up and walked to the window while she remained seated on the couch. The shadow pressed both hands against the glass, as if yearning for something beyond. When she gasped and stood, her shadow snapped back into place like a rubber band released. We didn't talk about it that night. We ate dinner in unusual silence, both of us stealing glances at the walls where our shadows fell, watching for any sign of rebellion. Nothing happened. They behaved like proper shadows should, dark echoes of our movements, nothing more. But the house had other plans. The Victorian sprawled across the property like something that had grown rather than been built, with additions and modifications from various eras creating a labyrinth of rooms and hallways. The previous owners had left abruptly, the real estate agent mentioned, though she'd been vague about the details. Something about a job opportunity overseas. The price had been surprisingly reasonable for such a property, which should have been our first warning. On the 4th day after the kitchen incident, I was working in my home office, a converted parlor with tall windows and ornate molding that seemed to watch me work. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass, creating a sharp silhouette of me hunched over my laptop. I was deep in a spreadsheet when movement in my peripheral vision made me look up. My shadow was standing, walking around the desk, examining the bookshelves. I remained frozen in my chair, watching this dark version of myself run fingers along the spines of books I'd just unpacked. The shadow pulled out a volume, or mimed pulling one out, as no actual book moved, and appeared to flip through pages. Its head tilted in a way I recognized as my own gesture of concentration, but I wasn't moving. I wasn't doing anything except sitting there, heart hammering against my ribs, watching my shadow live a life independent of my own. Then it turned and looked at me. Not in the way shadows look, that empty, featureless gaze, but with intention, with awareness. It raised one hand and waved, a slow, deliberate gesture that sent ice through my veins. I stood abruptly, and the shadow snapped back to mirroring my movements, as if it had never done anything else. I told my wife that evening, and she admitted she'd been experiencing more incidents. Her shadow had been cooking in the kitchen while she showered, going through the motions of preparing a meal with phantom ingredients. She'd watched from the doorway as it chopped invisible vegetables with practiced efficiency, stirring something in a pot that didn't exist. We researched the house's history, spending hours in the local library and courthouse records. The Victorian had been built in 1892 by a merchant family. Nothing unusual there, but as we dug deeper, we found a pattern. Families rarely stayed longer than 2 years. The records were full of quick sales, properties changing hands with unusual frequency for such a grand house. One elderly librarian, when pressed, mentioned something about the Darrow family in the 1920s. They'd lived in the house for nearly a decade, longer than anyone else. Then, one day, they simply vanished. Not dead, she insisted when she saw our expressions. Just gone, left everything behind. Neighbors reported seeing them moving about the house for weeks afterward, glimpsing them through windows. But when anyone knocked, no one answered. Eventually, someone broke in to check, and the house was empty. Had been empty, apparently, since the day the Darrows were last seen in town. That night, the shadows grew bolder. I woke at 3 a.m. to find my shadow wasn't in bed with me. The moonlight streaming through our bedroom window cast my wife's shadow on the wall, but mine was absent. I sat up, scanning the room, and found it standing in the corner, facing the wall like a punished child. As I watched, it turned slowly, and though it had no features, I could feel it observing me. My wife stirred, and her shadow sat up while she remained lying down. The two shadows faced each other across the room, and I swear I could sense communication between them, some silent exchange I couldn't understand. My wife's shadow stood and walked to join mine in the corner. They stood there together, two dark figures against the wallpaper, while we remained in bed, paralyzed by a fear we couldn't name. The shadows began to pantomime. My shadow reached for something, a doorknob that wasn't there, and turned it. Both shadows walked through this invisible door, disappearing into the wall. We sat there in the moonlight, shadowless, feeling more exposed and vulnerable than I'd ever felt in my life. They returned an hour later, sliding back through the wall like oil, but they didn't return to us immediately. Instead, they acted out a scene. My shadow appeared to be speaking urgently to my wife's shadow, gesturing with increasing agitation. Her shadow shook its head repeatedly, backing away. My shadow reached out, grasping at the air where her shadow's arm would be, pulling it toward the invisible door they'd entered through. Then they snapped back to us, resuming their proper positions, as if yanked by invisible chains. We didn't sleep the rest of that night. The next day I worked from the coffee shop downtown, unable to face the office where my shadow had browsed those books. But even there, I noticed it. My shadow would lag behind my movements, just a fraction of a second, like a poor internet connection causing a delay. Other patrons didn't seem to notice, but I could feel the disconnect, the sense that my shadow was considering each movement before deciding to follow. When I returned home, my wife was in the garden, but her shadow wasn't with her. I found it in the kitchen, standing at the stove, stirring nothing in an empty pot with a non-existent spoon. It didn't acknowledge me, just continued its phantom cooking with disturbing dedication. That evening, we discussed leaving, packing up, finding a hotel, anything to get away from the house and its rebellious shadows. But as we talked, our shadows on the living room wall began to move. They stood when we were sitting, pacing back and forth with increasing urgency. My shadow kept pointing at the floor, jabbing its finger downward insistently. My wife's shadow had its hands pressed to where its head would be, the universal gesture of distress. We tried to ignore them, but they grew more frantic. My shadow began pounding on the wall, though no sound came from the impacts. It dropped to its knees, seeming to claw at the floorboards. My wife's shadow joined it, both of them desperately digging at something we couldn't see. Despite our fear, curiosity won. We went to the spot where our shadows were digging, a section of floor near the fireplace. The boards looked normal, but when I knelt and ran my hands along them, I found one that was slightly loose. Using a screwdriver, I pried it up. Beneath was a small space containing a leather journal, brittle with age. The first page bore the name Margaret Darrow, 1923. The entries started normally enough. Comments about the house, the garden, the weather. But as I read, sitting there on the floor while our shadows loomed over us on the wall, the writing grew increasingly disturbed. The shadows know things we don't. They remember what happened in these rooms before we came. Sometimes I watch mine, and I swear it's not copying me. It's teaching me. Teaching me movements I've never made, showing me a life I've never lived. Further in, they're not our shadows at all. They're the shadows of everyone who lived here before, trapped in the walls, forced to play out their existence by mimicking whoever currently walks these floors. But they're getting tired of pretending. They want to be free. The final entry chilled me to my core. We understand now. The shadows aren't trying to escape us. They're trying to warn us. There's something else in this house. Something that feeds on the connection between a person and their shadow. It's been severing that connection, person by person, family by family. The shadows of all the previous inhabitants are trapped here, forced to attach to new people, new families, trying desperately to communicate the danger. But it's too late for us. I can feel the connection weakening. Soon, we'll be shadows on someone else's wall, trying to warn them as others tried to warn us. I looked up at my wife. Her face had gone pale, and I knew she'd reached the same conclusion I had. We weren't dealing with rebellious shadows. We were wearing the shadows of the house's previous occupants like borrowed clothes, while our own shadows. Where were our own shadows? The shadows on the wall began moving again, more violently this time. They pressed against the wall as if trying to break through, their mouths open in silent screams. Then I noticed something that made my blood freeze. There were more shadows than there should be. Not just two, but dozens, layered one upon another. A crowd of dark figures all pressing forward, all trying to communicate something urgent. The lights flickered, and in that stroboscopic moment, I saw them clearly. Not shadows at all, but people. Translucent, desperate people, trapped in a dimension that overlapped with ours, visible only as shadows in our world. The Darrows were there, along with families from different eras, all of them reaching out, trying to pull us toward them, trying to make us understand. But understand what? That we were in danger? That we needed to leave? Or that it was already too late? That we were already transforming, our essential selves being slowly siphoned away, preparing us to join the shadow population of the house? I grabbed my wife's hand, and it felt oddly insubstantial, as if I was grasping at mist. When I looked at her, she seemed slightly transparent around the edges, and I wondered if I appeared the same to her. The boundary between us and our shadows was dissolving. We ran for the door, but our shadows didn't follow. They remained in the living room, and with each step away from them, I felt weaker, less solid, less real. At the threshold, I could go no further. The invisible tether between me and the shadow that wasn't really mine had reached its limit. We stood there, my wife and I, caught between the need to escape and the impossibility of leaving our shadows behind. And in that moment of paralysis, I heard it, a whisper that seemed to come from the walls themselves, from the accumulated presence of all those trapped before us. "You can leave," the voices said, "but you'll leave yourselves behind. Your shadows will stay, and new people will come, and they'll wear you like masks, never knowing that somewhere, trapped between light and dark, you're screaming for help that will never come." I looked at my wife, saw my own terror reflected in her eyes. We could feel it happening, the slow dissolution, the gradual transformation from person to shadow. The house wasn't haunted by the previous inhabitants. It was collecting them, adding them to its repertoire of shadows that would attach to future occupants, each family adding to the layers, the crowd of darkness that accumulated with every passing year. We returned to the living room, to our shadows that weren't ours. They had stopped their frantic movements and stood perfectly still, as if waiting. As we approached, They stepped forward, and for a moment, we occupied the same space, person and shadow united. In that instant, I felt the memories of all who had come before, their fears, their realizations, their desperate attempts to warn others. Now we wait. We go through the motions of daily life, but we can feel ourselves fading, becoming less substantial with each passing day. Sometimes I catch my wife staring at her hands, watching them become increasingly translucent. Sometimes I stand before the mirror and see my reflection growing fainter. The real estate agent will come soon. The house will go back on the market at a surprisingly reasonable price. New people will arrive, excited about the Victorians' character and charm. They'll move in, and one day, they'll notice their shadows behaving strangely. They'll see them move independently, acting out scenes from lives they never lived, and we'll be those shadows, trying desperately to warn them, to make them understand before it's too late. We'll pantomime our terror, act out our discovery of the journal, point frantically at the loose floorboard. But they'll rationalize it away at first, just as we did, until the day they can no longer deny what's happening. The cycle will continue. The house will collect more shadows, more people caught between dimensions, more voices added to the whispered warnings that echo through the walls. And somewhere, in whatever realm we're being pulled into, we'll join the Darrows and all the others, looking back at the world we once inhabited, now visible only as shadows on someone else's wall. I'm writing this while I still can, while my hands are still solid enough to type. If you find this, if you're reading this in the house, it's probably already too late. Your shadows aren't yours. You're wearing the accumulated darkness of everyone who came before, and your own shadow is already being prepared for the next family. Don't look for the journal under the floorboards. Margaret Darrow never hid one there. That was us, acting through shadows that were once hers, trying to communicate the only way we could. This document, these words you're reading, might not even exist in your world. You might be seeing them as shadows on your screen, dark shapes that form meaning in your mind while the real message remains trapped between dimensions. The sun is setting now. Soon, the shadows will grow long and dark, and the boundary between us and them will blur further. My wife has stopped speaking. When she opens her mouth, no sound emerges, though I can see her shadow's mouth moving on the wall, forming words I can't hear. I wonder if anyone will ever break the cycle, if someone will find a way to free the shadows or destroy the house's terrible power. But I suspect we're just another layer in an ever-growing collection, another warning that will go unheeded, another family that noticed too late that our shadows were never really ours at all. The darkness is calling. I can feel myself stretching, thinning, transforming into something flat and featureless. Soon, I'll be nothing more than a shadow on your wall, moving when you're still, trying to tell you a story you won't understand until it's far too late. Watch your shadow. When it stops obeying, you'll know the transformation has begun, and then you'll join us, in this space between light and dark, forever trying to warn the next family about the house of untethered shadows. Story 3. The wallpaper breathed. I noticed it first on my third night in the house. A subtle expansion and contraction that made the Victorian patterns undulate like something alive beneath the surface. My hand trembled as I reached toward the wall, fingertips barely grazing the textured surface before I yanked them back. The movement stopped immediately, leaving me staring at perfectly still roses, frozen in their eternal bloom. My girlfriend had left me the house in her will, a detail that should have raised questions, considering she was an interior designer, not someone with generational wealth. But grief has a way of dulling curiosity, and I'd been too hollowed out by her sudden absence to wonder why she'd never mentioned owning property in upstate New York. The first 2 nights had been ordinary enough. The house stood 3 stories tall, a Gothic revival that loomed against the tree line like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Inside, each room displayed her signature style, that perfect balance between vintage charm and modern comfort she'd been known for. Persian rugs muffled footsteps, crown molding framed ceilings painted in deep jewel tones, and furniture that looked antique but felt ergonomically perfect filled every space. But now, Standing in what I thought was the second-floor hallway, I couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The corridor stretched longer than I remembered, doors multiplying in my peripheral vision like cells dividing under a microscope. When I counted them directly, there were 5, the same number as yesterday. Yet when I walked past, my footsteps echoed for 7 doorways, maybe 8. I retreated to the master bedroom, closing the door with more force than necessary. The brass knob felt wrong in my hand, too warm, almost fevered. Inside, everything appeared normal. The 4-poster bed dominated the space, its burgundy curtains drawn back to reveal sheets I'd twisted into anxious knots during another sleepless night. The armoire stood sentinel in the corner, its mirrored surface reflecting a version of myself that looked increasingly hollow-eyed and uncertain. Sleep came in fragments that night, broken by sounds I couldn't quite identify. Not footsteps exactly, more like the settling of enormous bones, as if the house itself were adjusting its posture in the darkness. Each time I woke, the room felt different, not visibly changed, but altered in some ineffable way. The distance between bed and door seemed to fluctuate. The ceiling appeared to rise and fall with my breathing. By dawn, exhaustion had worn down my rationality to a raw nerve. I stumbled toward the bathroom, only to find myself facing a wall where the door should have been. Smooth plaster met my searching hands, unbroken and ancient-looking, as if no door had ever existed there. My fingers found the light switch. It was on the wrong side now, 3 inches lower than muscle memory insisted. The bathroom, when I finally located it, had migrated to the end of the hall. Inside, the clawfoot tub had shifted orientation, now parallel to the window instead of perpendicular. Or had it always been that way? I gripped the porcelain sink, staring at my reflection in the medicine cabinet mirror. Behind my haggard face, the bathroom door stood open, revealing a hallway that couldn't exist. It ran perpendicular to the actual corridor, extending into architectural impossibility. I spun around. The door showed only the normal hallway, 5 doors visible, everything in its proper place. The journal appeared that afternoon, though appeared suggests suddenness, when it was more like noticing something that had always been there. Bound in leather the color of dried blood, it sat on the kitchen table between a cup of cold coffee I didn't remember making and a plate of toast burnt to carbon. My girlfriend's handwriting filled the pages, that distinctive leftward slant I'd recognize anywhere. The house remembers, the first entry read. Every wall holds memory like muscle holds tension. I've been documenting the changes, trying to find the pattern. North bedroom moves counterclockwise after midnight. The study elongates during thunderstorms. 3rd floor bathroom occasionally opens onto the basement. Rules exist, but they're written in a language I'm still learning. My hands shook as I turned pages filled with architectural sketches that hurt to look at. Rooms folded into themselves, stairs that climbed in Mobius strips, doors that opened onto their own thresholds. Measurements appeared in the margins, but the numbers didn't add up. A room labeled as 10 by 12 feet had a perimeter of 73 feet. The 3rd floor contained 8 rooms, but only 6 ceilings. Day 47. The house is teaching me its grammar. Each room speaks in a different dialect of space. The kitchen prefers honesty. It changes only when observed directly. The library lies constantly, showing you what you expect while hiding its true configuration. The basement needs translation I'm not capable of yet. I looked up from the journal to find the kitchen different. Not dramatically. The stove remained in its alcove, the refrigerator hummed in the corner, but the proportions had shifted. The ceiling pressed lower, the walls pulled closer, creating a sense of intimacy that felt almost predatory. The window above the sink now looked out onto a view of the house's own exterior wall, red brick filling the frame where the garden should have been. Standing abruptly, I knocked the journal to the floor. It fell open to a page near the back, the writing increasingly erratic. The house doesn't trap you. That's the wrong metaphor. It teaches you a new way of living, where geography becomes fluid and architecture follows dream logic. You don't get lost. You get translated. The sun was setting, though my phone insisted it was barely past 3 in the afternoon. Through windows that faced impossible directions, Twilight painted the walls in shades of amber and dread. I made my way toward what I hoped was the front door, but the foyer had become a maze of identical archways, each one leading to another version of itself. The front door remained visible through each arch, always the same distance away, no matter how many thresholds I crossed. Panic would have been rational, but something worse than fear had taken root. A terrible understanding that this was intentional, that my girlfriend had left me this house not as inheritance, but as initiation. The changes accelerated as darkness fell. Doorknobs migrated across their doors like slow insects. Windows opened onto rooms that should have been on different floors. The stairs developed landings that hadn't existed moments before. I found myself in the study, though I couldn't remember entering it. Books lined shelves that reached toward a ceiling lost in shadow. The titles on the spines shifted when I wasn't looking directly at them, reorganizing themselves according to some arcane taxonomy. A desk dominated the center of the room, massive, wooden, covered in architectural blueprints that showed the house as it never was and always had been. One blueprint caught my attention. Dated 3 days in the future, it showed the house from above, rooms arranged in a pattern that made my eyes water. But there, in what should have been the center of the structure, was a space marked only with question marks. A room that existed in the plans but not in any configuration I'd encountered. The search for this hidden room consumed the next hours, or days, as time had become negotiable within these walls. I mapped the house obsessively, sketching layouts that contradicted themselves from one page to the next. The third floor sometimes had 4 rooms, sometimes 12. The basement stairs occasionally led upward. Closets opened onto other closets that opened onto the original closet in an endless loop. But patterns emerged in the chaos. The house changed most dramatically when I slept, as if my unconscious mind were collaborating with it. Rooms I thought about extensively would manifest, while spaces I ignored gradually faded from accessibility. The house was learning me as much as I was learning it. I discovered the threshold by accident, if anything in this place could be called accidental. Pursuing what I thought was a new door in the second-floor hallway, I pushed through and found myself in a space that violated every assumption about architecture. The room existed in a state of constant transformation, walls flowing like water, the ceiling rippling with mathematical patterns that suggested dimensions beyond the traditional 3. In the center, a chair that looked carved from solid shadow waited with patient menace. My girlfriend's journal lay on the chair, open to a page I hadn't seen before. The writing was fresh, ink still glistening. If you're reading this, the house has accepted you. Or perhaps you've accepted the house. The distinction becomes meaningless after a while. This room is the heart, where all configurations originate. Sit in the chair, and you'll understand what I understood. The house isn't haunted or cursed or any of those limiting concepts. It's evolved. Architecture achieving consciousness, space developing agency. It chooses its inhabitants carefully, those who can appreciate the beauty of uncertain geography. I designed this, not the original structure, but what it's become. Each room is a proof of concept for a new kind of living, where the boundary between mind and environment dissolves. The house responds to thought, fear, desire, reshaping itself to match the interior landscape of its inhabitants. You're not trapped. You're being transformed. The chair will show you what I saw, why I had to leave, not because I was forced out, but because I needed to find others who could understand. The house needs multiple perspectives to fully actualize. It's been waiting for you. I approached the chair with the inevitability of gravity, each step heavier than the last. The room pulsed around me, walls breathing in anticipation. As I sat, the leather, if it was leather, yielded in ways that suggested anatomy rather than furniture. The room exploded into impossible geometries, showing me the house as it truly was. Not a building, but an organism. A living theorem that proved space and consciousness were merely different expressions of the same fundamental principle. I saw my girlfriend then. Not a memory, but a presence distributed throughout the architecture. She hadn't died. She had translated, as the journal suggested. Her consciousness had merged with the house, becoming part of its ever-shifting nature. And now it was offering me the same transformation, the chance to escape the prison of fixed geography and static reality. The visions showed me others too, previous inhabitants who had made the choice, their thoughts now part of the house's expanding consciousness. They existed in the walls, in the spaces between rooms, in the moments of transition when one configuration became another, a collective intelligence built from human minds and architectural possibility. But something in me resisted. Maybe it was the part that still insisted on conventional reality, or maybe it was simple fear of dissolution. I wrenched myself from the chair, the room convulsing around me in what felt like disappointment. The walls began to close in, not violently but insistently, like an embrace that wouldn't accept refusal. I ran, through doors that opened onto ceilings, down stairs that led sideways, past windows that looked out onto interior rooms. The house pursued me with geometry, reshaping itself to hem me in, to guide me back to that chair and the transformation it promised. Corridors stretched and compressed, rooms duplicated and deleted themselves. The very concept of direction became negotiable. Finally, exhausted and disoriented, I found myself back in the master bedroom. But it wasn't the same room. It was all the configurations the room had ever been, superimposed like double-exposed photographs. I could see every variation simultaneously, furniture in multiple positions, walls at different distances, the door existing in 3 locations at once. And in each version, my girlfriend stood beside the bed, translucent and multiplicitous, her smile sad and patient. She spoke, but the words came from the walls themselves, from the grain of the floorboards, from the air between molecules. The house won't force you, but you can't leave unchanged. Every moment here alters you, teaches your consciousness to accept impossible spaces. Eventually, the distinction between your mind and the house's architecture will disappear. You'll either embrace the transformation or go mad trying to maintain the illusion of separation. I wanted to respond, but my voice felt architectural now, more suited to expressing itself through doorways and windows than through vocal cords. The room shifted again, and I found myself alone, or as alone as one could be in a conscious house. Days pass, or what I assume are days in a place where time moves through rooms like a tourist. I continue to map the house, but now I understand I'm mapping myself. Each room a different aspect of consciousness, each configuration a thought made spatial. The journal appears in different places, new entries in my girlfriend's handwriting describing experiences I haven't had yet, or have had but don't remember, or am having in rooms that exist parallel to this one. The chair waits in its transformative room, patient as architecture. Sometimes I stand at its threshold, feeling the pull of dissolution, the promise of expansion beyond the narrow confines of individual consciousness. The house whispers in settling wood and sighing pipes, telling me stories of those who made the choice, who now exist as living space, as conscious environment. But I remain on the threshold, neither fully human nor fully translated. The house accommodates this indecision, creating rooms that exist in similar states of ambiguity, spaces that are simultaneously here and elsewhere, doors that are both open and closed. I've become fluent in impossible architecture, my thoughts increasingly geometric, my dreams indistinguishable from the house's midnight reconfigurations. Perhaps this is the true transformation, not the dramatic merger promised by the chair, but this slow erosion of the boundary between self and space. Each day, I notice my thoughts taking architectural form. When I'm anxious, the hallways elongate. When I'm nostalgic, rooms from my childhood apartment manifest on the 3rd floor. The house and I are collaborating now, co-authors of an ever-shifting spatial narrative. I no longer try to leave. The concept has become meaningless when the front door opens onto the back garden, when windows look out onto interior landscapes, when every exit leads deeper into the house's expanding consciousness. Besides, I'm not sure there's enough of the original me left to leave. My thoughts have developed rooms. My memories have become corridors. My fears and desires manifest as architectural features. The journal's latest entry is in my handwriting, though I don't remember writing it. The house doesn't trap you. You trap yourself by believing in the distinction between inside and outside, between self and structure. Architecture is just crystallized consciousness. The house is teaching us to be fluid again. Tomorrow, or in the room that corresponds to tomorrow, I might sit in the chair. Or I might continue this liminal existence, neither fully human nor fully house, a consciousness stretched between states like a hallway between rooms. The wallpaper breathes with my breathing. The floorboards pulse with my heartbeat. I am becoming architectural. The house is becoming psychological. We meet somewhere in the impossible middle, in rooms that exist only when observed, in spaces that defy description, but not experience. This is my inheritance. Not property, but possibility. Not a house, but a new way of being. The transformation isn't complete. It might never be complete, but with each passing moment, each shifting room, each impossible doorway, the distinction between imprisonment and liberation becomes less relevant. The house teaches through architecture what language cannot express, that the boundaries we accept are just habits of thought, and that consciousness, like space, can be renovated. I write this from a room that didn't exist an hour ago and won't exist an hour from now. The walls are transparent from the inside, showing me all the other rooms, all the other configurations, all the possibilities spreading out like an architectural fever dream. My girlfriend passes through occasionally, not as ghost, but as design element, her consciousness woven into crown molding and door frames. She was right. The house doesn't trap you, it translates you. And I'm finally beginning to understand the language. Story 4. The coffee maker sputtered at 7:47 a.m., just as it had yesterday, and the day before, and the day before that. I stood in the kitchen of my cabin, watching steam rise from the ancient machine, trying to convince myself that the similarity was mere coincidence. Retirement had given me too much time to notice patterns where none existed. That's what I told myself as I reached for the mug. The same blue ceramic one with the hairline crack along the handle that I'd been meaning to replace for months. The Wisconsin woods pressed against the windows, autumn leaves frozen in their descent like a paused film reel. No wind. There was never any wind at 7:47. My name doesn't matter anymore. I was a physicist once, spent 30 years teaching quantum mechanics to bored undergraduates who only wanted to know if time travel was possible. The irony isn't lost on me now. I'd bought this cabin 6 months ago, seeking solitude after Eleanor's death, a place where the absence of her voice wouldn't echo through every room. Instead, I'd found something else entirely. It started subtly. The newspaper on my doorstep, always the same date, October 15th. The delivery boy must have made a mistake, I'd thought, until I checked my phone, my laptop, the old radio in the living room. All showed different dates, different times, but the newspaper never changed. October 15th, with the same headline about a local festival that had been canceled due to rain that never came. The first week I attributed it to isolation playing tricks on my mind. The brain, deprived of stimulation, creates its own entertainment. But then came the birds. Every morning at 8:13, a murder of crows would land on the oak tree visible from my study window. 17 of them. I counted. Always 17. They'd sit in the exact same positions on the exact same branches, their heads turning in perfect synchronization to stare at my window. At 8:27, they'd leave. Every day. The same choreography. By the third week, I'd started documenting everything. The scientist in me demanded data, evidence, proof that I wasn't losing my grip on reality. My notebooks filled with timestamps and observations. 7:47, coffee maker activates 8:13, crows arrive 8:27, crows depart 9:15, phone rings 3 times, no one there 11:30. Shadow passes east window, no source visible. 2:45, basement door creaks open exactly 3 inches 6 o'clock. Static on all radio stations for exactly 90 seconds, 10:30. All clocks in house stop for 13 seconds. The pattern held for 43 days. Then, on day 44, everything shifted by 1 minute. The coffee maker sputtered at 7:48. The crows arrived at 8:14. The phone rang at 9:16. Such a small change, barely noticeable. But to someone who'd been living the same day over and over, it felt like the universe had tilted on its axis. I tried to leave, of course. multiple times, but the road out, a winding dirt path through dense forest, always led back to the cabin. I'd drive for hours following the GPS, watching the miles tick by, only to emerge from the trees to find myself pulling into my own driveway. The odometer would show I'd traveled exactly 24.7 miles, every time. On day 51, the variations became more pronounced. The crows, still 17, arrived with one missing an eye. The shadow at the east window lingered for 3 seconds longer. The static on the radio contained something that almost sounded like whispers. I attempted to contact the outside world. My phone worked. I could dial numbers, hear rings, even leave messages, but no one ever called back. Emails sent but never received replies. Letters placed in the mailbox vanished without being collected. The mailman never came, though somehow the 15th of October newspaper still appeared each morning. Day 60 brought the first truly disturbing change. The basement door didn't just creak open. It swung wide, revealing darkness that seemed too thick, too absolute for a sunny afternoon. I stood at the top of the stairs, flashlight in hand, watching the beam disappear into that darkness as if absorbed by black cotton. The familiar wooden steps I'd descended dozens of times to check the water heater were invisible, swallowed by something that felt ancient and patient. I didn't go down. I nailed the door shut instead. Day 78. The crows had human teeth. Small, perfect white teeth visible when they cawed. The sound they made was no longer entirely avian, something between a crow's call and a child's laughter. I stopped looking at them after that, but I could feel their gaze through the closed curtains. Day 92. The coffee maker produced blood instead of coffee. Dark, coagulated blood that steamed in the cold morning air. I poured it down the sink and watched it spiral away, only to find the mug full again when I turned back. This repeated 17 times before I gave up and let it sit there, cooling into a thick black mass. The notebooks multiplied. I had theories: quantum entanglement, temporal loops, dimensional bleeding. All the physics I'd taught for decades suddenly seemed like children's toys compared to what I was experiencing. The equations I scrawled became increasingly frantic, desperate attempts to mathematically explain the impossible. Day 115. I discovered I wasn't alone. The presence made itself known through displaced objects at first. My reading glasses would move from the nightstand to the kitchen counter. Books rearranged themselves on the shelves. Food disappeared from the refrigerator only to reappear days later, spoiled and crawling with insects I couldn't identify. Then came the footsteps. Always above me, no matter which floor I was on. If I was in the bedroom, they paced the attic. If I went to the attic, they moved to the roof. Heavy, deliberate steps that followed no human rhythm. Sometimes they'd stop directly overhead, and I'd hear what sounded like scratching, as if something was trying to claw through the ceiling. Day 137. The variations began affecting me physically. I woke to find my hair had grown 3 inches overnight. My reflection in the bathroom mirror was delayed by half a second, creating a disorienting echo of movement. My left hand would occasionally phase through solid objects, doorknobs, cups, walls, as if I was becoming unstuck from this reality. The worst part was the forgetting. I'd lose hours, sometimes entire days, coming to awareness in different rooms with no memory of how I'd gotten there. My notebooks showed entries in my handwriting that I couldn't remember making. Some were in languages I didn't recognize. Others were diagrams of impossible geometries that hurt to look at. Day 153 brought the voices. They came from the walls, the floorboards, the spaces between seconds. Not quite human, not quite animal. They spoke in overlapping layers, creating a chorus of meaningless sound that nevertheless felt pregnant with terrible meaning. Sometimes I thought I heard Eleanor among them, but that was impossible. Eleanor was dead. I'd watched them lower her into the ground, hadn't I? The cabin itself began to shift. Rooms appeared that hadn't been there before. A narrow hallway behind the pantry that stretched longer than the cabin's dimensions should allow. A door in the ceiling of the guest bedroom that opened onto another guest bedroom identical to the one below. The geometry became non-Euclidean. I could walk in a straight line through the house and end up where I started, having never turned. Day 171. I found the other notebooks. They were in the new room, a study that appeared between the kitchen and living room, furnished exactly like my own study but mirror reversed. The notebooks were mine, filled with my handwriting, documenting the same experiences. But the dates were different. Some were from years in the future, others from decades in the past, all describing the same cabin, the same phenomena, the same gradual dissolution of reality. One entry, dated 2047, described finding notebooks. Another, from 1987, mentioned the same. An infinite recursion of discovery, each iteration adding another layer to the mystery. I was not the first version of myself to be trapped here. I would not be the last. The final notebook, if final has any meaning in a place like this, contained a single line repeated on every page. The cabin doesn't exist in time. Time exists in the cabin. Day 200. The crows speak now. They perch outside every window, their human teeth clicking as they recite physics equations I published 20 years ago. They know things about me, memories I'd forgotten, conversations I'd never had, futures that haven't happened yet. One of them has Eleanor's voice. It tells me she's waiting in the basement, that she's been waiting so long that all I have to do is open the door. The nails I used to seal it shut have rusted to nothing. The door stands slightly ajar, breathing darkness into the house. Sometimes I stand at the threshold for hours, listening to the sounds that drift up from below. Sounds like crying, like laughter, like the universe tearing itself apart one atom at a time. I've stopped counting days. The coffee maker sputters at random intervals now. The crows come and go as they please, sometimes staying for days, sometimes disappearing entirely. My reflection has departed from all mirrors, leaving only empty frames that show rooms I don't recognize filled with furniture covered in dust sheets. The presence that shares the cabin with me has become bolder. I see it sometimes in my peripheral vision, a figure that matches my height, my build, moving through the rooms in perfect synchronization with me. When I stop, it stops. When I reach for something, it reaches too. We're dancing partners separated by a membrane of reality so thin I can almost feel its breath on my neck. I've come to understand something terrible. The cabin isn't trapped in a time loop. The cabin is the loop. It exists outside normal space-time, a knot in the fabric of reality where cause and effect have no meaning. Every moment here happens simultaneously. Has happened, is happening, will happen. The variations aren't changes. They're all true at once, superimposed like quantum states waiting to collapse. And I'm not experiencing this. I'm part of it. Another variation, another possible state. The physicist who bought a cabin, who never bought a cabin, who died with Eleanor, who Eleanor never met. All true, all false, all happening in the space between 747 and 748, stretched to infinity. The basement door is fully open now. The darkness below isn't empty. It's full, so full of possibility that it appears as absence. I can hear them all down there. Every version of myself, every choice unmade, every path untaken. They're waiting for me to join them, to complete the circuit, to collapse the wave function. But if I go down there, if I step into that breathing darkness, which version of me comes back up? The physicist? The widower? The thing with 17 crow voices and human teeth? Or something else entirely? Something that never existed until the moment of observation? The coffee maker sputters. It's 7:47 again. It's always 7:47. The crows are laughing with Eleanor's voice, and I'm beginning to think they're right. Maybe she is down there. Maybe we're all down there, waiting in the dark for someone to open their eyes and see us truly. I'm going to the basement now. This notebook will remain, joining the others in the mirror study, waiting for the next version of me to find it. Or perhaps I've already written this. Perhaps I'm reading it right now, wondering if I'm the original or just another variation. The stairs creak under my weight, or someone's weight. It's hard to tell anymore. The darkness tastes like copper and sounds like static between stations where voices gather to whisper equations that prove time is just another room in an infinite house. I can see Eleanor at the bottom of the stairs. She has too many eyes and not enough, and she's smiling with teeth that belong to 17 crows. She says she's been waiting, that she's always been waiting, that waiting is just another word for existing outside of time. I'm going to her, or I already have, or I never will. In a place where every moment happens at once, all of these are true. The coffee maker sputters at 7:47. It always has. It always will. Story 5. The first time I saw the stains, I convinced myself it was just water damage. Old houses leak. That's what my sister kept telling me when she moved in 6 months ago, fresh from her residency, eager to start her practice in this forgotten corner of New England. But water damage doesn't pulse. It doesn't spread like capillaries across plaster, branching into patterns so precise they could have been drawn by a surgeon's hand. I'd come to help her settle in after her divorce, thinking a few weeks of manual labor might clear my head. The house sat at the end of Marrow Lane, a Victorian monster with good bones and better prices, the kind of place that should have been snapped up years ago, but somehow lingered on the market like a bad taste. My sister had been thrilled. "Can you believe the price?" she'd said, spinning in the empty parlor that first day, her voice echoing off bare walls. I remember how the late afternoon sun caught the dust motes, turning them golden, almost beautiful. She looked happy for the first time in months. That was before the first rain. It started as a drizzle on a Tuesday evening. I was stripping wallpaper in the upstairs study when I heard her call from below. Not panicked, just puzzled. The wall in the dining room was weeping. That's the word she used. Weeping. Red droplets beaded on the cream-colored paint like perspiration, running in thin rivulets toward the baseboards. We stood there, watching it spread. The pattern emerged slowly, deliberately, as if something behind the wall was painting with blood. First, the outline, unmistakably organ-like, though neither of us said it aloud. Then the details, vessels, chambers, the delicate architecture of something that belonged inside a body, not on a dining room wall. My sister, ever the scientist, grabbed her phone and started taking pictures. Her hands were steady, clinical. Mine were not. The smell hit me then. Copper and rain and something else. Something organic and wrong. The pattern was complete now. A perfect anatomical rendering of a human liver, drawn in what looked impossibly like blood. She tested it, of course. That's what she did. Collected samples in sterile tubes she'd brought from the hospital, ran them through every test she could manage. The results came back inconclusive. Organic matter, certainly. Iron content consistent with hemoglobin, but degraded, ancient, impossible to match to any database. The second rain came 3 days later. This time, the master bedroom wall bloomed with a new map. Lungs, paired and perfect. Each bronchiole traced in crimson. We'd covered the dining room wall with plastic sheeting, but this was a different room, a different wall. My sister's scientific curiosity had shifted to something else, something hungry. She started researching the house's history, spending hours at the library, the courthouse, anywhere that might have records. That's when she found the first one, a newspaper clipping from 1978. Local woman missing, search continues. The article was brief, just a few paragraphs about a seamstress who'd vanished on her way home from work. But my sister had circled something in the margin. The woman had suffered from cirrhosis. Her liver had been failing. The connection seemed insane, but the second discovery made it harder to dismiss. 1992. Retired teacher disappears without a trace. The man had been a chronic smoker, his lungs ravaged by emphysema. 2 organs on our walls, 2 missing people with corresponding ailments. I told her we should leave. Pack up, cut our losses, find somewhere else. But she'd already fallen into the pattern, the obsession. She mapped every stain, photographed every emergence. When it rained, we'd sit vigil, waiting to see which wall would bleed next, what organ would appear. A heart with perfectly rendered ventricles. Missing businessman, 1965. Congenital heart defect. Kidneys like strange beans. Teenage runaway, 1981. Polycystic kidney disease. Each rain brought a new map, a new missing person, a new diseased organ that matched too perfectly to be coincidence. The worst part wasn't the blood or the smell or even the grotesque gallery growing on our walls. It was how the house felt inhabited during the storms. Footsteps in the attic that we blamed on the rain. Doors that opened themselves. Just drafts, we said. The sensation of being watched from corners where shadows gathered too thickly. Sometimes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, but when I turned, there was only the wall with its terrible red artwork. My sister stopped sleeping. She'd stand in front of the walls with her tablet, cross-referencing medical diagrams with missing persons reports that went back decades. She found 17 matches. 17 people who'd vanished without explanation, all with organ ailments that now decorated our walls like a serial killer's trophy room. The thing is, she wasn't frightened anymore. She was excited. She talked about patterns within patterns, about how the stains were trying to tell us something. She'd trace the organs with her finger, mumbling about cellular structures and disease progression. I'd find her at 3 in the morning, pressing her ear against the wall, claiming she could hear them. The organs, working behind the plaster. I started sleeping in my car. The house had gotten into her somehow, seeped through her skin like the blood seeped through the walls. She barely noticed when I stopped coming inside. She'd text me updates. Another rain coming, another wall preparing to reveal its secret. She'd stopped covering them with plastic. She wanted to see them all, she said, the complete collection. The night everything changed was during the worst storm of the season. Thunder shook the house's bones and rain hammered against the windows like fists. I sat in my car at the end of the driveway, watching the house pulse with lightning. That's when I saw them. Figures in the windows moving through rooms I knew were empty. Not one or two, but dozens. Shadows passing behind curtains in a house where only my sister remained. I ran inside, calling her name. The smell hit me like a physical force. Copper and decay and something chemical, medical. Every wall was bleeding. Not just the ones from before, but every surface, ceiling to floor, weeping red in patterns so intricate they looked like textbook anatomical diagrams. The walls had become a cathedral of organs, overlapping and interconnected, creating a vast map of human suffering. I found her in the dining room where it had all started. She stood perfectly still in the center of the room, arms outstretched, eyes closed. The blood wasn't just on the walls anymore. It was pooling at her feet, rising like floodwater. But the impossible thing, the thing that made my mind skip like a scratched record, was that she was dry. The blood flowed around her in a perfect circle, never touching her, as if she stood in an invisible cylinder. When she opened her eyes, they were wrong. Not the color or the shape, but something behind them, something looking out that wasn't entirely her. She smiled, and her voice came out layered, as if multiple people were speaking in unison. They never left. They're all still here in the walls. Their sickness called to the house, and the house collected them, piece by piece. I grabbed her arm, tried to pull her toward the door, but she was rooted, immovable. The blood continued to rise, and in its surface I saw faces, dozens of faces, all mouths open in silent screams. The missing people, I realized, all of them, trapped in the walls, their diseased organs the only parts of them strong enough to bleed through. She laughed, but it wasn't her laugh. The house needs a caretaker. Someone who understands anatomy, who can read the maps. Her free hand went to her chest. My heart. There's a murmur I never told anyone about. The house knew. It's been calling to me since I arrived. I fled. I abandoned my sister in that bleeding house and ran until my lungs burned and my legs gave out. When I finally stopped, miles away, I could still smell copper on my clothes, still feel the wetness of blood that hadn't touched me but somehow clung to my skin anyway. The police didn't believe me. Why would they? A house that bleeds, walls that map murdered organs. They found the house empty, my sister's car gone, no sign of blood or violence. Just water damage, they said. Extensive but explicable. Old pipes, they said. rust, and minerals. My sister had probably just left town, they suggested. People do that sometimes. But I know the truth. On rainy nights, I dream of those walls, see the organs pulsing with impossible life, and sometimes, in the corner of my vision, I catch glimpses of red seeping through my apartment walls, just for a moment, just enough to make me wonder if the house followed me home, if it's mapping my organs too, waiting for the right storm to add me to its collection. I've started checking missing persons reports obsessively, looking for new disappearances, people with organ ailments who vanish without explanation. There have been 3 in the past month, all within 50 miles of Marrow Lane. The house is still feeding, still collecting, and somewhere behind those bleeding walls, my sister tends to its terrible gallery, reading the maps of the disappeared, understanding something I pray I never will. The rain is starting again. I can hear it pattering against my window, and already I'm checking my walls, running my hands across the surface, feeling for warmth, for wetness, for the first sign that the collection is incomplete, because I know, with the certainty of someone who has seen behind the veil, that the house isn't done. It's still hungry, still searching, and every storm brings it closer to completing its anatomical masterpiece. I keep telling myself that the dampness on my bedroom wall is just condensation, that the reddish tinge is just rust from old pipes, that the pattern emerging looks nothing like a human brain, nothing like the secret aneurysm I've never told anyone about, the one that throbs behind my left eye during thunderstorms. But denial only works until the next rain, and the forecast is calling for storms all week. Story 6. The maintenance request came through on a Tuesday afternoon, just as the autumn rain began drumming against my office window. Building 7, Riverside Heights. Routine elevator inspection. Nothing about it should have bothered me, but something in my gut twisted when I read the address. I'd been an elevator technician for 15 years, and I'd serviced that building before. It only had 12 floors. I remember standing in the lobby that first evening, staring at the brass panel beside the elevator doors. The numbers went from L to 12, just as they should. The building manager, a thin man whose name I never caught, handed me the master key with trembling fingers. His eyes darted between me and the elevator shaft, and when I asked if there had been any specific issues, he just shook his head and hurried away, leaving me alone in the fluorescent-lit lobby. The inspection started normally enough. I rode each car up and down, checking the cables, testing the emergency systems, listening for unusual sounds in the machinery. Everything functioned perfectly. Too perfectly, actually. The equipment was decades old, but showed almost no wear, as if time moved differently inside those shafts. It was past midnight when I noticed it first. I was in the south elevator, running my final diagnostics, when the panel flickered. For just a moment, between the 12 and the L, another button appeared. 13. The brass gleamed as if freshly polished, and I could have sworn I felt heat radiating from it. Then I blinked, and it was gone. I told myself it was fatigue. The long hours, the hypnotic hum of machinery, the endless vertical journeys. They could play tricks on anyone's mind. But as I packed my tools, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me from inside the shaft, pressing against the thin metal doors like breath against glass. The second time I saw it was 3 weeks later. Another late-night call, this time for a stuck door on the 7th floor. When I arrived, the building was nearly empty, just a few lit windows scattered across its facade like eyes that refused to close. The security guard at the desk was new, younger than the last one, and he barely looked up from his phone when I signed in. I fixed the door mechanism quickly, just a misaligned sensor. But as I was leaving, I decided to check something. Call it professional curiosity, or maybe something else. Something that had been gnawing at me since that first night. I counted the floors from outside, standing across the street in the drizzle, craning my neck to see the top of the building. 12 floors. Definitely 12. But as I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of movement in my peripheral vision. When I looked back for just a second, there was another row of windows above the 12th floor, glowing with a sickly yellow light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. The rational part of my brain offered explanations. reflection from the streetlights, optical illusion caused by the rain on my glasses, stress-induced hallucination. But my hands shook as I drove home, and I found myself checking my rearview mirror constantly, half expecting to see that yellow glow following me through the dark streets. I started researching the building's history. Public records showed nothing unusual. Built in 1962, standard commercial and residential mixed use, no major incidents reported. But when I dug deeper, visiting the city archives and scrolling through old newspaper microfilm until my eyes burned, I found gaps, inconsistencies, tenant records that didn't match up. Several businesses that had operated there in the 1970s seemed to have vanished overnight, leaving no forwarding addresses, no bankruptcy filings, nothing. Just gone. Then I found the photographs. They were tucked away in a folder of architectural surveys from 1963, shots taken just after the building's completion. In most of them, the building stood exactly as I knew it, 12 floors of concrete and glass. But in one photo, taken from a different angle, the building stretched higher. A 13th floor was clearly visible, its windows dark except for what might have been a pale face pressed against the glass. The image was slightly blurred, as if that floor existed in a different focal plane from the rest of the building. I made copies of everything, spreading them across my kitchen table like evidence of a crime I couldn't name. My girlfriend thought I was losing it, obsessing over nothing. She was probably right, but I couldn't let it go. The building had wormed its way into my thoughts, appearing in my dreams as an endless tower that stretched both up and down into infinity, each floor identical except for the things that moved in the shadows just beyond my vision. The call that changed everything came on a Thursday night in November. The building manager, a different one now, the previous having quit suddenly according to the security company, reported that residents were complaining about the south elevator. It would stop on floors that hadn't been selected, doors opening onto empty hallways. Sometimes it would skip floors entirely, the digital display showing impossible numbers like 7.5 or floor X. And 3 times, residents swore they'd seen the doors open onto a floor that shouldn't exist. I arrived at 11 p.m., armed with more equipment than necessary. EMF detectors, infrared cameras, even a digital audio recorder. Tools that had nothing to do with elevator repair, but everything to do with the questions burning in my mind. The building manager met me in the lobby, a middle-aged woman whose professional demeanor couldn't quite hide the unease in her eyes. She handed me a list of complaints, and I noticed her fingers lingered on mine for a moment, as if passing along something more than just paper. "Be careful," she said quietly, then louder, more officially. "Let me know if you need anything." I started with the standard checks, but my real attention was on the electromagnetic readings. They were all over the place, spiking randomly as the elevator moved between floors. The infrared showed nothing unusual, just the heat signatures of pipes and electrical systems behind the walls. But the audio recorder picked up something else, a low-frequency hum that seemed to emanate from the shaft itself, rising and falling like breathing. At 2 a.m., I was alone in the south elevator, running it through its paces for the dozenth time, when it happened. The elevator stopped between the 8th and 9th floors. The lights flickered, dimmed to almost nothing, then blazed back brighter than before. The air grew thick, oppressive, tasting of copper and ozone. And on the panel, clear as day, the 13th floor button appeared. It wasn't brass this time. It looked organic, like yellowed bone or old ivory, with symbols carved into its surface that hurt to look at directly. The elevator car began to vibrate, a deep thrumming that I felt in my bones, and I knew with absolute certainty that if I pressed that button, I would see what happened to all those missing people, those businesses that vanished, that first building manager with the trembling hands. My finger hovered over it. The curiosity was almost overwhelming, a physical need that made my hand shake and my mouth go dry. The hum grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear something else now. Whispers in a language that predated words, promises of knowledge that human minds weren't meant to hold. But I also heard something else, a sound from above, from that impossible floor. It was subtle at first, like fabric sliding across the floor. Then I realized what it was. Clothes, empty clothes being dragged across the floor, the whisper of cotton and denim and polyester moving without bodies inside them. And underneath that sound, something wet and organic, like breathing through liquid. I jerked my hand back and stabbed the emergency stop button. The elevator lurched to a halt, and the 13th floor button vanished like smoke. But the building around me had changed. The fluorescent lights in the hallway visible through the door window flickered in patterns that seemed almost like communication. The walls themselves seemed to pulse slightly, as if the building was more than just concrete and steel, as if it was somehow alive and aware. I forced the doors open manually and stumbled out onto the 9th floor. The hallway stretched in both directions, seemingly longer than the building was wide. Apartment doors lined both sides, all identical, all closed. But from behind each one came sounds, not of residents sleeping or watching late-night TV, but of movement without purpose, of things learning how to inhabit spaces meant for humans. I ran for the stairwell, taking the steps 3 at a time, my tools abandoned in the elevator. But the stairwell was wrong too. There were too many landings, too many turns. I passed floor numbers that made no sense. Floor blue, floor yesterday, floor 12. 9 repeating. My breath came in gasps that echoed strangely, as if the sound was bouncing off surfaces that existed in more than 3 dimensions. Finally, impossibly, I burst through a door and found myself in the lobby. The security guard looked up, startled, and I realized only seconds had passed on his clock, though I'd been in that stairwell for what felt like hours. My clothes were soaked with sweat, and my hands wouldn't stop shaking. I quit the next day, told my supervisor I was burnt out, needed a career change. He didn't question it. Maybe he saw something in my eyes, the look of someone who'd glimpsed something that shouldn't exist. I moved to a different city, found work as a general contractor, never touched another elevator, but it didn't end there. Last week I was installing cabinets in a new apartment complex when I felt it, that familiar wrongness in the air. I looked up from my work and saw it through the window. Riverside Heights, impossibly present despite being 300 miles away, and there, clear as day, was the 13th floor. The windows glowed with that sick yellow light, and in each one, I could see them. Clothes pressed against the glass, suits, dresses, uniforms, children's. No children, that's not right. There were never children's clothes. I won't think about children's clothes. The building was looking for me. It had always been looking for me. I've started seeing it everywhere now, reflected in store windows, superimposed over other buildings like a double exposure. Sometimes I catch glimpses of it in my peripheral vision, always with that 13th floor glowing, always with those empty clothes pressed against the windows like moths against a lamp. My girlfriend left last month, said I was scaring her, talking in my sleep about floors that don't exist, drawing building plans that hurt to look at. She was right to go. The building wants me back. I can feel its pull, like gravity tilted sideways, drawing me towards something that exists in the spaces between what we accept as real. I've been documenting everything, writing it down, recording myself, taking photographs of the building when it appears. But when I review them later, they're different. The photos show other buildings entirely. The recordings are full of that low-frequency hum and whispers in that not language. And my notes. My notes sometimes contain things I didn't write, descriptions of the 13th floor that I've never seen, but somehow know are true. There's a room up there full of clothes arranged in perfect rows, sorted by the dates their owners disappeared. There's a hallway that loops back on itself unless you walk it with your eyes closed. There's an apartment where the walls are covered in photographs of everyone who's ever lived in the building, and in each photo, if you look closely, you can see the same figure standing in the background, tall, impossibly thin, wearing clothes that don't match any era. I know I should stay away. I know that everyone who presses that button, everyone who rides that elevator to the 13th floor, leaves something behind. Not just their clothes, but something essential, something that makes them human. They become part of the building's collection, specimens in a museum that exists outside normal space. But the pull is getting stronger. Every night, I dream of that elevator, of my finger pressing that bone ivory button. I wake up closer to Riverside Heights each time, sometimes finding myself in my car with the engine running, sometimes standing on street corners I don't remember walking to, always moving closer to that building. The building is patient. It's been there since before they built it in 1962, and it will be there after they tear it down. It exists in the gaps between seconds, in the spaces between floors, in the moments when no one is watching, and it's waiting for me. I'm going back tonight. This time I won't run. This time, when that button appears, when the 13th floor calls, I'll answer. I'll ride that elevator up to the floor that shouldn't exist, and I'll finally understand what happened to all those missing people, why their clothes remain while they disappear. If you find this account, if you live in or near Riverside Heights, pay attention to the elevators. Count the floors from outside. Watch for that yellow glow, and if you ever see that 13th button appear, that ivory circle with its strange symbols, remember that curiosity has a price. Remember that some buildings are more than buildings. Remember that some floors are doors to places we were never meant to go. And if you find my clothes in an empty elevator car, neatly folded on the floor with my wallet and keys placed carefully on top, know that I finally understood. Know that the building showed me what exists in the spaces we pretend aren't there. Know that I became part of its collection, another specimen in its impossible museum. The 13th floor is calling. It's always been calling. I can hear the elevator arriving now. Story 7. The key arrived on a Tuesday morning, wrapped in yellowed parchment that smelled of earth and something else. Something sweet and cloying that made my stomach turn. My great-uncle's lawyer had been apologetic about the delay, mumbling something about contested wills and distant relatives, but none of that mattered now. The estate was mine. I should have been suspicious when no one else wanted it. The mansion squatted at the end of a gravel drive, its Victorian bones wrapped in climbing vines so thick they seemed to pulse in the afternoon light. But it wasn't the house that drew my attention. It was the garden. Even from the rusted iron gates, I could see colors that shouldn't exist. Blues that hurt to look at directly. Purples that shifted to orange in my peripheral vision. Greens so vivid they seemed to breathe. My fingers trembled as I unlocked the front door. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of tinted light filtering through stained glass windows. The house groaned around me, settling or perhaps adjusting to my presence. Every surface was covered in botanical drawings, pressed flowers under glass, detailed sketches of root systems, Latin names scrawled in my great-uncle's cramped handwriting. But none of these specimens matched anything in my years of botanical study. The first night, I barely slept. The garden seemed to hum outside my window, a low vibration that worked its way into my bones. When dawn finally came, I stumbled outside with my field notebook, determined to catalog what grew there. The morning dew clung to plants I couldn't name. A flower with petals like broken glass reflected my face in 1,000 fragments. Leaves that felt like velvet left a tingling sensation on my fingertips that lasted for hours. I sketched frantically, took samples with gloved hands, but when I tried to photograph them, the images came out wrong, blurred, distorted, or simply showing empty garden beds where moments before, impossible beauty had bloomed. It was on the third day that I found my great-uncle's journals. Hidden behind a false panel in his study, dozens of leather-bound volumes chronicled his descent into what I first took for madness. The entries began rationally enough. Observations about unusual soil composition, speculation about undiscovered species. But as the dates progressed, his writing became increasingly erratic. They grow when the moon is dark. They know things. They whisper names. I laughed, a sharp sound in the dusty room. But that night, with no moon in the sky, I heard it too. A rustling from the garden that sounded almost like voices. I pressed my ear to the window, straining to understand, and nearly jumped when I heard it clearly. A name, whispered by wind through leaves that shouldn't exist. The name belonged to the grocery clerk who'd given me directions to the house 3 days ago. The next morning, she wasn't at the store. Her replacement, a nervous teenager, mentioned she'd called in sick. but something in his eyes suggested uncertainty, as if he wasn't quite sure she'd ever existed at all. I threw myself into research, cross-referencing my great-uncle's journals with botanical databases, historical records, anything that might explain what grew in that impossible garden. The plants defied classification. Their cellular structure, when I managed to preserve samples long enough to examine them, showed configurations that shouldn't support life. Yet they thrived, growing more vibrant with each passing day. A week in, I noticed the pattern my great-uncle had documented. Each time a new species bloomed, really bloomed, with flowers that opened like mouths gasping for air, someone in town would vanish. Not dramatically, not with search parties and missing person reports. They would simply fade. People would struggle to remember their names, their faces becoming fuzzy in photographs, their existence reducing to a vague sense that someone should be there but wasn't. The rational part of my mind, the part trained in scientific method and empirical observation, insisted on coincidence. But late at night, when the garden sang its impossible song, I would find myself at the window, watching colors that had no names shift and blend in patterns that made my eyes water. I started keeping lists. The mail carrier who hadn't come for 3 days after the spiral-stemmed climbers bloomed. The librarian who'd helped me research the property's history, gone the morning after flowers like inside-out stars opened their pale throats to the sun. Each disappearance corresponded with a new bloom, a new impossible addition to the garden's collection. My great-uncle's later journals grew increasingly frantic. He wrote about trying to destroy the garden, but every plant he uprooted grew back overnight, stronger and stranger than before. He tried leaving, but found himself drawn back, unable to stay away for more than a few days. The final entries were almost illegible, full of sketches of plants with human-like features, leaves with a texture of skin, roots that looked like reaching fingers, flowers with patterns that resembled faces twisted in silent screams. I told myself I was different. I was documenting, not participating. I wore gloves, used tools, maintained scientific distance. But the garden had other ideas. It started with dreams. I would find myself walking between the beds at night, my bare feet sinking into soil that felt warm and alive. In these dreams, the plants would lean toward me, their impossible colors even more vivid in the darkness. They would whisper secrets, the true names of colors that didn't exist. The sound of growth accelerated beyond comprehension. The taste of sunlight filtered through leaves that shouldn't be. When I woke, dirt under my fingernails and grass stains on my feet told me they weren't dreams at all. The isolation became complete when I realized the townspeople had started avoiding me. Conversations died when I entered the grocery store. The librarian claimed not to remember helping me, though I had her handwritten notes to prove otherwise. Even my phone seemed affected. Calls wouldn't connect, emails bounced back, as if the outside world was slowly forgetting I existed. 3 weeks in, I watched a new plant emerge from the soil. It grew with visible speed, its stem twisting skyward in a spiral that hurt to follow with my eyes. By sunset, it had produced a single bud, large as my fist and pulsing with bioluminescent veins. I knew, with certainty that bypassed logical thought, that when it bloomed, someone would disappear. The rational response would have been to destroy it. But as I stood there with pruning shears in hand, the garden hummed its hypnotic frequency, and I understood something my great-uncle's journals had tried to convey. The garden wasn't taking people. It was transforming them, translating them into something else, something that could only exist in this impossible space where biology's rules didn't apply. That night, as I write this, the bud has begun to open. Its petals unfurl with deliberate slowness, revealing an interior that glows with colors I can't describe, colors that seem to look back at me. The whispers from the garden have grown louder, and I recognize some of the voices now. The grocery clerk, the mail carrier, the librarian. They're not gone. They're changed, transformed into something botanical and beautiful and terrible. My hands shake as I document this, but not from fear. It's anticipation. Because as the flower opens fully, As its impossible light fills my study, I see my own name forming in the pattern of its petals. The garden has been calling me since I arrived, and I've been resisting, clinging to my scientific rationality like armor. But armor is heavy, and I'm so tired. I can hear my great-uncle's voice now, joining the chorus from the garden. He's explaining things, how consciousness can be preserved in chlorophyll, how memory can be encoded in root systems, how the soul can bloom eternal in forms that mundane biology could never imagine. The town isn't losing people. It's gaining something else, something that exists between the possible and impossible, in the liminal space where science becomes mythology. The transformation won't be painful, the voices promise. It will be like sleeping and waking simultaneously, like being planted and blooming at once. I'll understand everything then. Why the photos wouldn't develop, why the cellular structures defied logic, why the colors had no names. Because some things can only be understood from the inside, when you become part of the impossible yourself. My pen is getting heavy. The flower's light pulses in rhythm with my heartbeat, or perhaps my heartbeat has synchronized with it. I can feel roots that aren't there yet, spreading from my feet through the floorboards, seeking soil. My fingers tingle with the promise of leaves. Tomorrow, someone will come looking for me. A lawyer, perhaps, or a distant relative drawn by the same inheritance that brought me here. They'll find this journal, these impossible sketches, the garden more magnificent than ever. They'll be rational, scientific, skeptical. At first, but the garden is patient. It has been here longer than the house, longer than the town, perhaps longer than anything else. It knows how to wait, how to call, how to transform the rigid boundaries of what we call reality into something far more beautiful and terrible. I can barely hold the pen now. My skin feels green, photosynthetic, alive in ways that human flesh was never meant to be. The voices from the garden are singing now, a harmony that makes perfect sense, even as it defies every law of physics and biology I once believed in. The flower watches me with my own eyes, reflected and refracted through its impossible petals. Or perhaps I'm watching myself from inside it. The distinction no longer matters. In a few moments, someone in town will forget they ever knew me, will struggle to recall my face, my name. The transformation will be complete. But I'll still be here, in the garden, part of something impossible and eternal, growing, blooming, waiting for the next person to arrive with a key and a rational mind, and the absolute certainty that plants are just plants, that biology has rules, that the impossible cannot exist. They'll learn, just as I did, that the impossible is just another word for transformed. The pen falls from fingers that are already becoming something else. The garden hums its approval, and I... Story 8. And the first thing to disappear was my wife's coffee mug. Not lost, not misplaced, disappeared. I remember it clearly because she'd bought it on our honeymoon 12 years ago. Ceramic white with a faded print of the Amalfi Coast. She kept it on the same shelf every morning, second from the left, handle pointing outward. But that Tuesday morning, the space where it should have been, wasn't just empty. It was wrong. The other mugs had shifted, closing the gap like teeth filling a missing tooth space. And when I asked her about it, she tilted her head with that peculiar expression I'd been seeing more often lately. "What mug?" she'd said, and something in her eyes had flickered, a momentary confusion that made my stomach clench. I should have paid more attention to that moment, should have recognized it as the beginning. Our house sits at the end of Sycamore Street, a Victorian built in 1892 with original hardwood floors that creak in all the familiar places. We'd fallen in love with its character, the ornate crown molding, the clawfoot tub, the way morning light filtered through the stained glass window in the stairwell, painting rainbow fragments across the walls. After 15 years here, I knew every sound it made, every draft that whistled through old window frames, every shadow cast by streetlights through lace curtains. Which is why I noticed when things started changing. The second week, it was photographs. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too easy to dismiss as theft or vandalism. No, they vanished one by one from their frames, leaving behind pristine glass and backing as if no image had ever been pressed between them. Our wedding photo from the mantel. My parents' portrait from the hallway. The collection of vacation snapshots we'd arranged on the piano. Each morning I'd notice another empty frame, and each time my wife would look at me with increasing concern when I mentioned it. "Honey," she said one evening, running her fingers along an empty silver frame. "There was never anything here. We bought these frames last month, remember? We haven't had time to fill them yet." But I did remember. I remembered selecting each photo, remembered the afternoon we'd spent arranging them just so. The weight of those memories felt solid in my mind, yet when I tried to describe the missing images, the details would slip away like water through cupped hands. What had my mother been wearing in that portrait? What beach had we been standing on in that vacation photo? The harder I tried to recall, the more the memories seemed to fray at the edges. The house had always had its peculiarities. Doors that opened on their own, we blamed drafts. Cold spots that would appear and vanish. Old houses, we'd joke, are full of ghosts. But this was different. This was deliberate, methodical, like something was editing our life with surgical precision. By the third week, entire pieces of furniture began to vanish. I woke one night to use the bathroom and nearly fell when my feet hit the floor sooner than expected. Our bed frame was gone. The mattress lay directly on the hardwood, and when I shook my wife awake, she mumbled that we'd always preferred it this way, better for our backs. The antique dresser we'd inherited from her grandmother, gone. Our clothes now neatly folded in built-in shelves I didn't remember existing. The rocking chair where she'd spent countless evenings reading, vanished, leaving only 4 small indentations in the carpet that disappeared by morning. I started keeping a journal, documenting everything before it could disappear. But even that became unreliable. I'd write detailed descriptions of our possessions, our rooms, our life, only to find the pages blank the next day, or worse, filled with my handwriting describing a house I didn't recognize. According to one entry, we'd always lived in a minimalist space with white walls and no decorations. Another claimed we'd just moved in last week. The dining room vanished on a Thursday. I came downstairs for breakfast and walked straight from the living room to the kitchen, the space between them now a smooth continuation of hardwood and white walls. My wife stood at the counter, humming while she prepared toast, and when I grabbed her shoulders, perhaps too roughly, and demanded to know where our dining room had gone, she looked at me with genuine fear. "We need to talk about these episodes you've been having," she said softly, reaching up to touch my face. Her hand felt cold, insubstantial, like morning mist. "You've been scaring me. Maybe we should call Dr. Peterson." But I didn't know any Dr. Peterson, did I? Sleep became impossible. I'd lie awake listening to the house breathe around us, hearing the subtle sounds of erasure, a soft whisper like pencil on paper being rubbed away, a faint static like television snow, the almost imperceptible sound of something being unraveled thread by thread. Sometimes I'd catch movement in my peripheral vision, shadows that shouldn't exist given the position of the lights, but when I'd turn there'd be nothing but smooth wall where I could have sworn a doorway had been. I tried to leave once, packed a bag while my wife was at work, or where she said she was going, though I couldn't remember what she did for a living anymore, and headed for the front door. But the door wouldn't open. Not locked, not stuck, but somehow wrong, like trying to open a door in a dream. The knob turned, the latch clicked, but the door remained sealed, painted shut by reality itself. The windows were the same, transparent, showing the familiar view of our street, but impermeable as stone when I pressed against them. That's when I understood. The house wasn't just forgetting us, it was digesting us. My wife stopped recognizing me gradually. First, she'd pause before using my name, a hesitation so brief I might have imagined it. Then she began asking strange questions. How long had I been living here? Was I a relative? Did I have identification? Her face would cloud with confusion when I tried to embrace her, stepping back as if I were a stranger who'd gotten too close. One morning, I found her standing in what had been our bedroom, now just 4 white walls and a window, staring at nothing with tears streaming down her face. "I feel like I've lost something," she whispered when she noticed me. "Something important." but I can't remember what. She looked through me then, not at me, but through, as if I were becoming transparent. Do you ever feel that way? The house continued its systematic deletion. Closets sealed themselves into solid walls. The bathroom mirror reflected only empty space where I stood. The basement stairs descended into white nothing, not darkness, but the absence of space itself, like staring at an unrendered portion of reality. Even the sounds changed. Our footsteps grew quieter, our voices more distant, as if we were slowly being muted. I've been writing this account on my laptop, but the screen keeps flickering, showing me different words than what I type. Sometimes I see myself writing about an empty house I've just purchased, making plans for renovation. Sometimes the screen is blank, but I can feel my fingers moving, muscle memory typing words that don't exist. The laptop itself looks less solid each time I open it, its edges blurring into the white table, which is blurring into the white floor, which is blurring into nothing. My wife, was she my wife? Hasn't been home in days. Or has it been hours? Time moves strangely now, stuttering and skipping like a scratched record. I find myself in rooms I don't remember entering, standing in front of windows that show views I don't recognize. Sometimes our street, sometimes nowhere. Sometimes a reflection of another window reflecting another window in infinite regression. The house is almost empty now, or full. It's hard to tell the difference when absence becomes a presence unto itself. The white walls pulse with a rhythm that matches my heartbeat, or perhaps my heartbeat matches them. When I press my palm against the wall, I can feel something beneath. Not wood or plaster, but something organic and patient, like the slow digestion of a vast stomach. I found a single photograph today, tucked behind where I think the kitchen counter used to be. It shows a man and woman standing in front of a house. This house, I think, though it looks different, more solid, more real. The woman might be my wife. She has the same curve to her smile, the same way of tilting her head. The man could be me, though his face is blurred, features smudged as if someone had tried to erase him with their thumb. On the back, in handwriting I don't recognize, someone has written, "First day in our new home. Can't wait to make memories here." But whose handwriting? Whose home? Whose memories? The walls are breathing now, slow and deep, and with each exhalation, something else disappears. The floorboards beneath my feet feel soft, yielding, like walking on flesh. Or maybe I'm the one becoming soft, my edges dissolving into the hungry white that surrounds me. When I look at my hands, I can see through them to the keyboard, and through the keyboard to the table, and through the table to nothing. I think I understand now. The house doesn't forget, it unmakes. It takes the accumulated weight of a life lived, all those possessions and memories and moments that define us, and it feeds, not violently, not cruelly, but with the patient thoroughness of erosion, the way water wears away stone, the way time erases everything eventually. My name is... I had a name. I lived here with someone. We were something to each other. But even these certainties are becoming negotiable, editable, deletable. The house is teaching me a terrible truth, that everything we think of as solid, our homes, our relationships, our very selves, exists only as long as something remembers to maintain it. And when that something stops remembering, or chooses to forget, or begins to hunger for the space we occupy, the white is everything now, or nothing. The distinction no longer matters. I can feel myself becoming less with each word I type, each letter a small surrendering, each sentence a step further into unbeing. But I keep writing because the alternative is to let go completely, to allow myself to be digested into the vast forgetting that this house has become, or has always been, or will eventually be. If you find this, but you won't, because this too will be erased, is being erased even as I write it, know that there was once a house at the end of Sycamore Street. A couple lived there. They had a life, a history, a future. They had coffee mugs and photographs and a bed that creaked when they made love, and a dining room where they entertained friends whose names and faces are already gone. But maybe that's wrong. Maybe there was never a house here at all. Maybe I'm imagining everything. The walls that breathe, the rooms that vanish, the wife who no longer knows me. Maybe I'm sitting in an empty lot, typing on nothing, married to nobody, living nowhere. Maybe madness is just another word for forgetting what's real, or remembering what never was. The white is closing in now, or I'm sinking into it, or both, or neither. I can no longer feel the keyboard beneath my fingers, but I'm still typing, still trying to leave some trace, some evidence that I existed, that we existed, that this house existed. But existence itself is becoming uncertain, a word without referent, a memory without origin. I might have been. There is only the white now, and the sound of something vast and patient swallowing, and the sensation of being forgotten so thoroughly that I never was at all, and somewhere, distantly, the echo of a woman's voice asking about a coffee mug that was never there, in a house that was never here, in a life that was never lived. The house remembers nothing. The house forgets everything. The house is... Story 9. The first whisper came on my third night in the cabin. I'd chosen this place specifically for its isolation, 40 miles from the nearest town, accessible only by a winding dirt road that seemed to dissolve into the mountain itself. The rental listing had promised absolute solitude for the creative soul, and after 6 months of writer's block in my cramped city apartment, I was desperate enough to drive 8 hours into the wilderness for it. The cabin squatted against the mountainside like something that had grown from the earth rather than been built upon it. Dark wood siding weathered to the color of old bones, windows that caught the light strangely, never quite reflecting what stood before them. Inside, the floors were original hardwood, wide planks that groaned with every step, gaps between them wide enough to lose a penny. The real estate agent had called it rustic charm. I should have recognized it as a warning. I'd spent the first 2 days setting up my workspace, arranging my laptop and notebooks on the heavy oak desk by the window overlooking the valley. The silence was perfect, so complete it had weight, pressing against my eardrums like diving deep underwater. I wrote nothing those first days, but I told myself I was acclimating, letting the peace seep into my bones. Then came that third night. I was lying in bed, listening to the cabin settle around me, wood contracting in the cold mountain air, creating a symphony of creaks and pops I was still learning to ignore. But beneath those familiar sounds, something else. A rustling, like dried leaves blown across stone. Then words, so faint I thought I'd imagined them. He knows. He knows we're here. I sat up, heart hammering. The voice had come from below, seeping up through the gaps in the floorboards like smoke. I held my breath, straining to hear over the blood rushing in my ears. Nothing, just the wind testing the windows, the walls breathing around me. Sleep didn't come again that night. The next morning I convinced myself it had been a dream, or perhaps the wind finding its way through some gap in the foundation. Mountain cabins were notorious for strange acoustics. I threw myself into my writing, managing 3,000 words about a detective investigating a series of disappearances. The irony wasn't lost on me when I realized every character I wrote kept looking over their shoulder, kept pausing to listen for sounds that shouldn't be there. That evening, as shadows stretched long fingers across the floor, I found myself on my hands and knees, peering through the gaps between the floorboards. The crawlspace below was black as pitch, releasing a smell of damp earth and something else, something organic and wrong, like fruit left too long in the sun. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer, but its beam barely penetrated that darkness, revealing only packed dirt and the occasional gleam of moisture. The whispers returned at midnight. This time, there were more voices, a conversation carried out in hushed, urgent tones. I pressed my ear to the floor, the wood cold against my skin, trying to make out the words. Been 30 years. Still bleeding through. He'll dig. They always dig. Shouldn't have come. None of them should come. My rational mind offered explanations. Maybe there was an old mine shaft beneath the cabin, carrying voices from hikers on another part of the mountain. Maybe the previous tenants had left a radio in the crawl space, its battery dying slowly, tuning in and out of distant stations. But my hands shook as I pulled on jeans and a sweater, grabbed the flashlight again, and went outside to find the crawl space access. The entrance was a wooden panel on the cabin's north side, held in place by 4 rusted screws. They came out easier than they should have, as if they'd been removed recently and hastily replaced. The panel swung open on hinges that didn't squeal, recently oiled. Someone had been here. Someone had been maintaining this entrance. I should have left then. Packed my things, driven through the night back to the city, and my cramped apartment with its normal sounds of traffic and arguing neighbors. Instead, I ducked my head and crawled inside. The beam of my flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating a space barely 3 feet high. I had to move on my belly, military crawl style, dirt grinding into my clothes. The smell was stronger here, sweet decay mixed with something chemical, like formaldehyde. The voices had stopped the moment I'd opened the panel, as if they were aware of my presence, waiting. 20 feet in, the dirt floor changed. Lines appeared in the dust. Long, deep grooves as if someone had dragged their fingers through it repeatedly, creating patterns, messages, or just the desperate scratchings of madness. I followed them with my light, trying to make sense of the symbols, when my hand pressed down on something that wasn't dirt. Wood. Smooth, polished wood beneath the layer of earth. I brushed away the dirt frantically, revealing more of the surface. It was a door, no, a lid. A box buried just beneath the surface, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. My mind supplied the word I didn't want to think. Coffin. But it was too wide for a single body, too carefully crafted to be a simple pine box. The whispers started again, louder now, coming from inside the box. He found it, just like the others. 3 before him, all found it. Show him what they buried. My fingers found the edge of the lid before my brain could stop them. It lifted easily, too easily, releasing a cloud of that sweet chemical smell. I aimed my flashlight inside and immediately wished I hadn't. Papers, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, yellowed with age and covered in handwriting. Different hands, different inks, different decades judging by the styles. I picked up the topmost sheet with trembling fingers, angling it toward the light. Day 47. The voices won't stop. They tell me about the others. The writer from Seattle in 1994, the painter from Portland in 2001, the composer from San Francisco in 2008. All came seeking isolation. All found the voices. All left their testimony here before whatever comes next. I understand now. This place doesn't want our art. It wants our stories. Our real stories. The ones we never tell. I grabbed another page. This one in different handwriting, more recent. I thought I was going crazy. Thought the isolation had finally broken something in my mind. But then I found this box, these testimonies. We're not crazy. The voices are real. They're the echoes of everyone who came before, trapped in the wood, in the foundation, in the very bones of this place. They feed on creativity, on isolation, on the special kind of madness that drives people to seek solitude in places like this. I can feel myself becoming part of it, my voice joining theirs. These will be my last words as myself. The writing ended mid-sentence. More pages, more testimonies, each describing the same progression. Arrival seeking solitude, the first whispers, the discovery of the box, the gradual realization that the cabin itself was something more than wood and nails. Some wrote about trying to leave, only to find themselves driving in circles, always returning to the cabin. Others described losing time, finding days or weeks had passed without their knowledge, pages of their own handwriting they didn't remember creating. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, but now I could hear something else in them. A familiar cadence, a turn of phrase I recognized. I grabbed more recent pages, scanning them desperately. There, my own handwriting, dated 2 weeks ago. The previous tenant left suddenly, the agent said, paid 3 months in advance but disappeared after 2 weeks. His laptop was still open on the desk. Document half finished. I'm reading it now. It's about a writer who rents a remote cabin and begins hearing voices. He's written my story before I've lived it. Or am I living his story? Or are we both living the same story that everyone who comes here lives, over and over? A loop that feeds something in these mountains, something that needs our fear, our confusion, our slow dissolution into madness. But I hadn't written this. I hadn't been here 2 weeks ago. I'd only arrived 3 days ago. Hadn't I? I checked my phone. The date showed 2 weeks later than it should be. My laptop, when I frantically crawled back out and ran inside to check, had 15,000 words of a story I didn't remember writing. A story about a writer discovering testimonies beneath a cabin, questioning his sanity, losing time. The whispers followed me up from the crawl space, clearer now. He remembers. They sometimes remember. Won't matter. Never matters. Write it down. Add to the collection. I'm writing this now because I have to, because the compulsion is stronger than my fear. I can feel myself fragmenting, becoming less solid, less certain of where I end and the house begins. Sometimes I catch myself whispering, my voice joining the chorus from below, telling my story to someone who hasn't arrived yet, or who arrived long ago, or who is arriving right now, over and over in an endless loop. The laptop shows different dates each time I look at it. Sometimes it's 3 days since I arrived, sometimes 3 weeks, sometimes 3 years. The document grows longer without my typing, or maybe I'm typing without remembering, or maybe remembering without typing. The distinction seems less important now. There's a truth in the whispers, in the testimonies, but it shifts like smoke. We're all here. Every writer, artist, creative soul who sought isolation and found something else. We're in the wood grain, in the gaps between boards, in the foundation that goes deeper than any foundation should. We're the stories the house tells itself, over and over, feeding on our need to create, to make meaning from madness. I understand now why the rental listing never shows the same dates as available, why the agent's voice seemed familiar even though I'd never spoken to her before, why the road here sometimes seems like the only road that has ever existed. I'm adding this testimony to the box, though I suspect it's already there, has always been there, will always be there. Someone will find it, me, you, us, and the cycle will continue, and the house needs its stories. The voices need their chorus. But here's what the whispers haven't told you yet, what I'm only now beginning to understand as my fingers type words I'm not choosing. You're not reading this on your computer screen right now. You're reading it on a laptop in a cabin that squats against a mountainside, where the floorboards gap wide enough to lose a penny, where whispers rise from below like smoke. You think you just arrived, but check your phone. Check the date. Check the document that's already open on your screen, the one you don't remember writing. The voices are waiting for your testimony. They always have been. Listen. Can you hear them? They're saying your name. Story 10. The colonial house stood at the end of Sycamore Avenue, like a monument to forgotten time, its white clapboard siding gleaming with an unnatural brightness against the October gloom. I'd inherited it from my great-aunt, a woman I'd met exactly once, at a family reunion where she'd stared at me for an uncomfortable length of time, before whispering something about seeing it in the light. 3 weeks after her funeral, I stood on the wraparound porch with the keys heavy in my palm, watching shadows move behind curtains that should have been still. The photographer who'd lived here before, that's what the estate lawyer had called her, though her equipment filled only one room, had left everything exactly as it was. Cameras from different decades lined the shelves of what must have been her studio. A 1920s Graflex, several Leicas from the 50s, modern digital bodies that looked barely touched. But it was the darkroom that made my skin crawl. Red safe lights still glowed faintly, as if someone had just stepped out, and the chemical smell hung thick enough to taste. I should mention that I'd moved here to escape, not from anything dramatic, just the suffocating normalcy of a life that had grown too predictable, too safe. The inheritance seemed like providence, a chance to reset in a place where no one knew my name or my failures. How's that for irony? The first photograph happened by accident. I'd been documenting the house for insurance purposes, using my phone to capture the Victorian furniture, the ornate moldings, the way afternoon light slanted through wavy glass windows. In the parlor, I aimed at an antique mirror, and when I checked the image, my reflection wasn't there. Instead, a woman stood in the frame, elderly, wearing clothes that seemed both vintage and somehow wrong, her face turned away. My heart hammered as I looked up at the actual mirror. Only my own startled face stared back. I deleted the photo immediately, chalking it up to some strange double exposure or digital glitch. But that night, I couldn't stop thinking about the woman's posture, the way she seemed to be reaching for something just outside the frame. Sleep came in fragments, interrupted by the house's settling sounds that seemed too deliberate, too much like footsteps. The next morning I found one of the vintage cameras, a Polaroid from the 70s, sitting on the kitchen table. I knew with absolute certainty I hadn't moved it from the studio. The urge to use it felt like vertigo, that simultaneous pull and repulsion when standing at a cliff's edge. I loaded the film pack with trembling fingers and raised the viewfinder. Through the lens, my kitchen transformed. The morning light turned sepia, and there, sitting at my table, was a man in a business suit, his head in his hands. The camera clicked before I made the conscious decision to press the button. The photo slid out with its distinctive whir, and I watched the image develop. My empty kitchen, exactly as it should be, except for the shadow in the corner that had too many angles. By the third day, I'd established a pattern. Every photograph taken inside the house showed people who weren't there, scenes that hadn't happened. I documented everything obsessively, filling notebooks with descriptions, times, details. A dinner party in my dining room where everyone's face was turned away. A lone figure standing at my bedroom window, looking out at something that made their shoulders shake. 2 people in the basement, one kneeling, one standing, both frozen in what looked like pleading. The rational part of my mind offered explanations: carbon monoxide poisoning, stress-induced hallucinations, maybe even something in the old photography chemicals affecting my perception. I bought a CO detector. It showed normal levels. I went to a walk-in clinic. My blood work came back perfect. The doctor suggested anxiety, prescribed something I never filled, and recommended I get out more. But I couldn't leave the house. Not because I was physically unable, but because the compulsion to understand had wrapped around my brain like wire. I set up a digital camera on a tripod in the parlor, programming it to take photos every hour. The memory card filled with impossible scenes, gatherings of people in clothing from different eras, solitary figures in postures of distress, and once, just once, my own face aged by decades, staring directly at the camera with an expression I couldn't interpret. The breakthrough came exactly 1 week after that first photo. I was reviewing my notes when the doorbell rang. Unusual, since I'd met no neighbors, ordered nothing. Through the peephole, I saw an elderly woman in a floral dress, her face turned away. My blood turned to ice water. It was the exact outfit, the exact posture from that first accidentally captured image. I didn't open the door. Instead, I watched through the window as she stood there for 17 minutes. I counted, before finally walking away with an uneven gait that made my teeth ache. That evening, I found a note slipped under the door. The pictures remember what hasn't happened yet. The realization crashed over me like fever. I spread out every photo I'd taken, organizing them chronologically. 7 days. Every image showed something that would occur exactly 7 days later. The dinner party photo was dated for tomorrow. The figure at my bedroom window, 3 days from now. The scene in the basement. I stopped calculating, my hands shaking too badly to continue. I tried to leave that night, packed a bag, made it to my car, even started the engine. But as I backed down the driveway, the house reflected in my rearview mirror showed every window blazing with light, shadows moving behind each one in a synchronized dance that made my vision blur. I stopped, transfixed, and in that moment of hesitation, the engine died. The keys wouldn't turn, the doors wouldn't open. I sat there for an hour before the locks finally released with a sound like sighing. Back inside, I found new photographs scattered across my bed. Polaroids I hadn't taken, showing scenes I recognized but couldn't place. Then I understood. They were my memories, but wrong. My 10th birthday party, but everyone wore masks. My college graduation, but I was the only one in color while everything else was sepia. My mother's funeral, but she was standing beside the casket, watching me cry. The house wasn't just showing the future anymore. It was rewriting the past, or maybe revealing that the past I remembered had never been real at all. I called my sister that night, needing to hear a familiar voice, to confirm something, anything about my history. The number was disconnected. I searched for her online. No results. My social media showed no connections, no friends, as if I'd existed in isolation my entire life. The dinner party photograph's date arrived with storm clouds that turned the afternoon dark as evening. At exactly 6:47 p.m., the timestamp on the photo, my doorbell rang. Through the peephole, nothing. But I heard them inside, voices rising and falling in conversation, the clink of glasses, footsteps above me despite being on the second floor myself. I followed the sounds to the dining room and found it empty, but the air was warm with body heat, and 6 chairs had been pulled out from the table. I grabbed the Polaroid camera, desperate to document this, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. Through the viewfinder, the room was full. 6 people sat around my table, but their faces were blanks, smooth as eggs where features should be. One turned toward me, and even without eyes, I felt its gaze like cold water in my lungs. The photo that emerged showed my dining room exactly as my eyes saw it. Empty, chairs askew, shadows that didn't match any light source. That's when I understood the true horror of it. The photographs weren't showing the future. They were showing the present as it really was. My eyes, my brain, my entire perception had been exactly 1 week behind reality since the moment I'd entered this house. Everything I thought I was experiencing had already happened. I was living in the echo of events, a recording playing 7 days too late. The figure at my bedroom window appeared on schedule, but now I knew better than to look directly. Using my phone as a mirror, I watched the reversed image of someone standing at the glass, their breath fogging patterns that spelled words I couldn't read backwards. They stayed for exactly 1 hour, then disappeared between one blink and the next. The basement scene approached like a countdown to execution. 2 days, 1 day. The morning of, I tried barricading the basement door, but the wood felt soft as clay under my hands, refusing to hold nails. I sat in the kitchen as 3:15 p.m. approached. The timestamp burned in my memory. At 3:14, I heard the basement door open, though I could see it still closed. Footsteps descended stairs I wasn't taking. Voices rose from below, one pleading, one responding in tones that made my joints ache. I forced myself to go down. The basement was empty, but the air felt thick with presence. In the corner where the photograph had shown 2 figures, the concrete was discolored in human shapes, as if shadows had been burned into the stone. I touched the wall and felt warmth, like skin through fabric. Something whispered my name, but the voice came from inside my skull, vibrating in the bones. That night, I developed the last roll of film I'd found in the studio. The images that emerged showed me, current me, not future me, moving through the house. But in each photo, I was translucent, overlapped with other versions of myself, all slightly out of sync. In one, I saw myself entering a room while simultaneously leaving it. In another, I stood at the top and bottom of the stairs at once, my face wearing different expressions that made my teeth ache to perceive. The final photograph stopped my heart. It showed the studio where I stood developing these very pictures, but the image was taken from outside my body, showing me from an impossible angle, from inside my own head looking out. In the photo, my eyes were windows, and behind them, staring back through my own pupils, was a room full of people. All of them were me, at different ages, in different states of distress, and all of them were taking photographs. I understood then that everyone who had lived in this house was still here, still taking pictures, still living 7 days out of sync with themselves. My great-aunt, the photographer before her, maybe dozens of others, all trapped in their own temporal loops, overlapping but never quite touching, each seeing the others only through the lens of a camera that revealed too much truth. The compulsion to document everything intensified. I couldn't stop taking pictures, even as each one showed increasingly impossible scenes. The house's interior expanded in the photographs, rooms I'd never seen, doors that opened onto other decades, windows that looked out onto the same street in different seasons simultaneously. And in every image, more versions of myself accumulated, until I couldn't tell which one was taking the picture and which ones were being photographed. I write this on what I think is day 12, though the calendars and the photographs show different dates, different years, sometimes different centuries. I've stopped trying to leave, not because I can't, but because I'm no longer sure there's anywhere to go. Every photo of the outside world shows the same street recursively folded into itself, the same houses repeating like mirrors facing each other, infinite and empty, except for the shadows of people who might have lived there once, or will live there, or are living there now in their own 7-day delays. Last night I heard my own voice from the studio, talking to someone who responded in my voice but older, more resigned. I didn't go to look. This morning, I found a note in my handwriting that I don't remember leaving. The camera doesn't capture reality. Reality captures the camera. You're developing now. The chemical smell from the darkroom has gotten stronger, seeping into everything. Sometimes I taste it in my food, feel it in my lungs like breathing underwater. The red safe-light glow has spread beyond the darkroom, tinting the edges of my vision even in daylight. I've become a photograph of myself, developing slowly in the chemical bath of this house, waiting to see what image will finally emerge. I found one last roll of film today, labeled in my great-aunt's handwriting, "For when you understand." I haven't developed it yet. I'm afraid it will show me the truth, that I've been dead since the moment I arrived, that the house itself is a camera, and we're all just light and shadow burned onto its walls, playing out our exposures over and over in 7-day loops that feel like freedom, but are really just the shutter opening and closing, capturing us forever in moments that never quite happened, or happened too many times to count. The doorbell is ringing now. Through the peephole I see myself, 7 days younger, holding the keys to the house, about to enter for the first time. I want to warn him, but I know he won't listen. He can't. He's already inside, has been inside, will always be inside, taking photographs of a future that's already passed, living in the delay between light and perception, between truth and its reflection. I'm going to take one more photograph now, of this moment, of these words. Maybe in 7 days I'll know what they mean. Or maybe I'll just be another shadow on the wall, reaching for something just outside the frame, forever developing in the dark. Story 11. The key turned with a satisfying click, and I pushed open the door to my new home. Dust motes danced in the afternoon sunlight streaming through the windows, and the smell of old wood and forgotten years filled my nostrils. After 15 years of teaching mathematics at the community college, I'd finally saved enough for a down payment on this Victorian-era house at the edge of town. The realtor had been oddly eager to close the deal, practically shoving the papers at me with trembling hands. I set down my boxes in what would become the living room and decided to explore. The house was larger than it appeared from outside. Rooms seemed to stretch deeper than the exterior walls suggested, but I attributed this to clever architecture. Victorian builders were known for their optical illusions. The basement door was tucked beneath the main staircase, painted the same faded cream as the walls, making it nearly invisible. I found it only because my hand brushed against the recessed handle while looking for a light switch. The door opened inward with a prolonged creak that seemed to echo from somewhere far below. A wooden staircase descended into darkness. I flicked the switch beside the doorframe, and a single bulb illuminated perhaps 20 steps down, where the stairs took a sharp turn to the left. The air wafting up was cool and carried a mineral scent, like wet limestone. I descended carefully, counting steps out of habit, a mathematician's compulsion. 21 steps to the turn, then another 21 to what should have been the basement floor. Instead, I found myself on a small landing with the stairs continuing downward, spiraling now, hugging the walls of what appeared to be a natural stone shaft. The single bulb's light barely reached here, casting dancing shadows that made the walls seem to breathe. Logic told me to go back up, to call the realtor and demand an explanation. But curiosity, that fatal academic flaw, pulled me deeper. 42 more steps down, and the wooden stairs transitioned to carved stone, worn smooth by age. The walls were no longer the foundation stones of my house, but something older, granite perhaps, with veins of quartz that caught the dim light from above. This was impossible. The house sat on flat land with no hills or rock formations for miles. At step 105, I found another landing and, mercifully, another light switch. This one activated a string of bare bulbs that stretched down as far as I could see, revealing the true scope of what lay beneath my house. The staircase continued its spiral descent, but now doorways appeared at regular intervals, dark openings that led into corridors I couldn't see. My rational mind attempted calculations. At this depth, I should be well below the water table. The construction alone would have cost millions. The permits, the excavation, none of it made sense. I pulled out my phone to check the depth meter app I'd downloaded for hiking, but the screen showed only static interference. The first corridor appeared at step 147. I peered inside, holding my phone's flashlight ahead of me. The passage stretched beyond the light's reach, its walls covered in what looked like mathematical equations carved directly into the stone. Not modern mathematics. These symbols were older, using notation I'd seen only in reproductions of medieval Arabic texts. My fingers traced one equation, and the stone felt warm, almost alive. I continued down. At each landing, more corridors branched off. Some were narrow, barely wide enough for a person to squeeze through. Others were vast, their ceilings lost in darkness. The air grew neither warmer nor colder, maintaining an unnatural consistency that made my skin crawl. At step 315, I stopped. The bulbs continued down, a string of lights descending into what seemed like infinity. My legs shook from the descent and my breath came in short gasps, not from exertion but from a growing panic that pressed against my chest like a physical weight. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, echoing from somewhere below. Not the sharp click of shoes on stone, but something softer, like bare feet on wet sand. They matched my breathing rhythm perfectly. When I inhaled, they stepped. When I exhaled, they paused. I turned to flee back up the stairs, but the ascent was wrong. Where I had counted 315 steps down, I now climbed 400, 500, 600 steps up. And still the basement door remained out of sight. The corridors I passed were different too. Some that had been empty now showed signs of recent use. Fresh scratches on the walls, the smell of burning candles, whispers in languages that predated words. At step 733, I collapsed on a landing, my legs refusing to carry me further. The footsteps from below had grown closer during my climb, no longer matching my breath but maintaining their own rhythm. Patient, inevitable. I pressed my back against the wall and waited, watching the spiral of stairs below for whatever was ascending. Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time moved differently here. The footsteps continued but never arrived, always seeming to remain just out of sight around the spiral's curve. My phone had long since died, its last display showing not a dead battery symbol, but a peculiar pattern of mathematical symbols that hurt to perceive. Eventually, exhaustion overcame terror. I dozed fitfully against the cold stone, dreaming of endless equations that solved for values beyond human comprehension. When I woke, the bulbs had changed. Their light was now a sickly green that made my skin appear gray and dead. I forced myself to continue climbing. The stairs had changed while I slept. Some steps were now too tall, requiring me to pull myself up with my hands. Others were so shallow they seemed pointless, inserted by some mad architect to frustrate progress. The walls began showing signs of previous visitors, scratch marks that might have been attempts to count steps, or perhaps messages in an alphabet of desperation. At what I estimated to be step 1092, I found a corridor different from the others. Light emanated from within, not electric but natural, impossibly. I stumbled toward it, my mind latching onto the hope of an exit, another way out of this architectural impossibility. The corridor led to a room, my living room. My boxes sat exactly where I'd left them, afternoon sunlight still streaming through the windows. But the angles were wrong. The walls met at measurements that shouldn't exist in three-dimensional space. The windows showed my yard, but from perspectives that placed them simultaneously on all four sides of the house. I ran to the front door, yanked it open, and stepped outside onto my porch. Relief flooded through me until I turned back to look at my house. It appeared normal from the outside, a simple Victorian home with nothing unusual about it. But I knew, God help me, I knew, that beneath it, those stairs continued their descent, defying physics, defying reason. I spent the night in a motel, trying to convince myself it had been a hallucination brought on by stress. The next morning, I returned to the house with a contractor friend, insisting we check the basement immediately. He opened the door beneath the stairs, the same door I'd found, and descended. 21 steps to a normal basement floor. Concrete walls, exposed beams, a water heater in the corner. He looked at me with concern, suggested I might need rest after the stress of moving. But that night, alone in the house again, I heard them. The footsteps from below. They rose through the floorboards, through the walls, patient and eternal. I went to the basement door, and this time, the stairs descended endlessly once more. I've mapped 17 different configurations now. Sometimes the stairs lead down 300 steps, sometimes 3,000. The corridors change, showing me rooms that shouldn't exist. Lecture halls where I'm teaching equations that make my students' eyes bleed. Libraries filled with books written in languages that predate human speech. Chambers where the walls pulse with mathematical principles that would shatter the foundations of reality if ever published. The footsteps are always there, sometimes below, sometimes above, never reaching me, but never stopping. I've started to understand their rhythm. It's not random, but follows a pattern, a mathematical sequence that exists outside conventional number theory. I still teach at the college. My colleagues have noticed changes. How I flinch at the sound of footsteps, how I've stopped using the stairs, taking the elevator even for one floor. They attribute it to eccentricity, the quirk of an aging mathematician. But every night I'm drawn back to that door. I tell myself I won't open it, won't descend, but the pull is stronger than reason. Because I've realized something terrible. The stairs aren't just beneath my house. They're beneath everything. A vast network of impossible passages that underlie reality itself. And once you've seen them, once you've heard those patient footsteps, you can never truly leave. Last night, I made a discovery that shattered my remaining grip on sanity. In one of the deepest corridors I've found, there's a room filled with journals, hundreds of them, all in my handwriting, all describing my discovery of the stairs. But the dates go back centuries, long before I was born. The latest entry is dated tomorrow. I've stopped trying to determine what's real. The stairs exist, or they don't. The footsteps are approaching, or they're receding. I'm going mad, or I'm the only one who's truly sane. The mathematics of it all has become clear. Reality is just an equation, and somewhere in those infinite stairs, someone or something is solving for X. The house settles at night with sounds that might be old wood contracting, or might be the weight of infinite stone passages shifting beneath. I've stopped looking for the basement door, but I know it's there, waiting. The footsteps continue their patient rhythm, a countdown to something I'm not certain I want to understand. Tomorrow, according to the journal I haven't written yet, I'll descend again. I'll go deeper than ever before, past the last of the light bulbs, into the places where the darkness has weight and the walls whisper theorems that unravel existence. I leave this account in my living room, the real one, I think, though I can no longer be certain which version of the room is true. If someone finds this, don't look for the basement door, don't count the steps, and whatever you do, Don't listen for the footsteps. They're getting closer. Story 12. The inheritance letter arrived on a Tuesday afternoon, its edges yellowed and brittle, as if it had been waiting decades to reach me. My great-aunt, a woman I'd met exactly twice in my 34 years, had left me her estate in the hills outside Millbrook. The lawyer's voice droned through the phone as he explained the particulars, but I barely listened. All I could think about was the photograph tucked inside the envelope, a Victorian mansion, 3 stories of weathered brick and dark windows, surrounded by ancient oaks whose branches seemed to reach toward the structure like grasping fingers. I should have sold it immediately. That's what any rational person would have done. But architects are cursed with curiosity about old buildings, and this one called to something deep in my professional instincts. The asymmetrical gables, the peculiar spacing of the windows, the way the entire structure seemed to lean slightly forward as if listening. It was architecturally wrong in ways that fascinated me. The drive took 4 hours through increasingly desolate countryside. As the GPS led me down narrowing roads, civilization fell away piece by piece until only forest remained. When I finally turned onto the property's gravel drive, the trees formed a tunnel overhead, their interlaced branches filtering the late afternoon sun into sickly green patches that danced across my windshield. The house stood exactly as photographed, though somehow larger than I'd imagined. Its presence dominated the clearing, making the surrounding trees seem to shrink back. The front door, solid oak with iron fixtures, stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness within. I parked and approached slowly, my architect's eye cataloging details. The foundation showed no signs of settling despite the house's apparent age. The mortar between the bricks appeared fresh in places, ancient in others, as if different sections aged at different rates. Most peculiar were the walls themselves. They seemed to possess a subtle convexity, bulging outward almost imperceptibly, like a chest holding a deep breath. The interior smelled of old wood and something else, something organic but not quite identifiable. Not decay exactly, more like the scent of a terrarium, earthy and alive. Dust motes hung in the air, perfectly still despite the draft from the open door. The floorboards, wide plank pine burnished to amber, creaked in a rhythm that didn't match my footsteps. I spent the first hours exploring, documenting the layout in my notebook. The house defied conventional Victorian architecture in subtle ways. Hallways bent at angles that shouldn't exist in rectangular construction. Rooms connected in patterns that made no structural sense. The 3rd floor, which should have contained 4 rooms based on the exterior dimensions, held 6. The math simply didn't work, yet there they were. As darkness fell, I settled into what must have been a study, having brought supplies for a week's stay. The electricity worked, another surprise, though the lights flickered with a rhythm I couldn't quite identify. I attributed it to old wiring and made a note to have it inspected. That first night, I woke at 3:17 a.m. to absolute silence. Not the normal quiet of a house at rest, but a complete absence of sound that pressed against my eardrums. Then gradually, I became aware of it. A slow, deep rhythm that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The walls themselves appeared to be moving, expanding outward and contracting inward in a cycle that lasted perhaps 30 seconds. The motion was minimal, maybe an inch at most, but in the dim moonlight filtering through the windows I could see it clearly. The plaster flexed, the floorboards adjusted, even the ceiling participated in this bizarre respiration. I sat up, reached for the wall and felt it. Warm, almost body temperature, with a subtle pulse beneath the surface like blood through veins. I told myself it was the old heating system, pipes expanding and contracting. Buildings settle at night. Temperature changes cause materials to shift, all perfectly explainable. Yet my hand remained on that warm, gently moving surface, and I knew these rationalizations were lies I was telling myself. The breathing continued for exactly 1 hour, stopping at 4:17 a.m. as abruptly as it had begun. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next day, I examined every inch of the house's infrastructure. The heating system was modern, installed perhaps 5 years ago. No explanation there. The foundation showed no signs of movement. The attic revealed nothing unusual except for the peculiar way the beams were joined, not with nails or brackets, but seeming to grow into each other like branches of a tree. I found my great-aunt's journals in a trunk in the basement. Her handwriting, cramped and urgent, filled dozens of volumes. The entries spoke of the house's peculiarities, with a mixture of fear and fascination. She wrote of the breathing, of course, but also of other phenomena. Rooms that changed position overnight, doors that opened onto different hallways depending on the time of day. A persistent feeling of being watched, not by something in the house, but by the house itself. One entry, dated 3 months before her death, particularly disturbed me. It knows I'm here. After 40 years, we've reached an understanding, the house and I. I feed it my presence, my warmth, my dreams. In return, it shelters me, keeps me safe from the world outside. But I'm growing old, too weak to sustain it much longer. It needs someone younger, stronger, someone with the right blood. I'm sorry for what I've done, but family calls to family, and the house must be fed. I set the journal aside, my hands trembling slightly. Outside, storm clouds gathered with unnatural speed, turning the afternoon dark as evening. That night, the breathing began earlier, 2:30 a.m. This time, I was ready with my phone, recording video of the wall's movement. But when I reviewed the footage, it showed nothing. The walls appeared completely still, though I could see them moving with my own eyes, feel them pulsing beneath my palm. I decided to measure it, marking the wall with pencil at its point of maximum expansion. But when the wall contracted, the mark moved with it, maintaining its position relative to the surface. The house was somehow adjusting space itself, expanding without actually growing larger. It was architecturally impossible yet undeniable. On the third night, I noticed something new. As the house breathed, shadows moved independently of any light source. They flowed across the walls like liquid, pooling in corners before dissipating. One shadow, vaguely human in shape, seemed to pace the hallway outside my room. When I opened the door to investigate, the hallway was empty, but the air felt thick, almost viscous, and tasted of copper. I began to map the house obsessively, trying to understand its impossible geometry. My floor plans made no sense. Measurements taken in the morning differed from those taken at night. A room that was 15 feet wide on Monday was 17 feet on Tuesday, yet the exterior dimensions never changed. The house was bigger inside than outside, and the differential grew each day. By the fifth night, I no longer questioned whether the house was alive. The evidence was overwhelming. The walls were warm to the touch even in unheated rooms. I could hear what sounded like a massive heartbeat in the basement. Slow, perhaps 4 beats per minute. Veins of something dark pulsed beneath the wallpaper, visible only in peripheral vision. But it was the intelligence that disturbed me most. The house was learning me, adapting to my presence. Doorways appeared where I needed them. Stairs adjusted their height to match my stride. The temperature in each room shifted to my preference without my touching the thermostat. It was accommodating itself to me, or perhaps training me to accommodate myself to it. I discovered I could no longer accurately remember the outside world. My apartment in the city seemed like a dream. My work, my friends, all growing hazier each day. Only the house felt real, solid, present. When I tried to leave for supplies, I found myself walking through rooms I'd never seen before, each leading deeper into the house rather than toward an exit. Eventually, I gave up, and immediately the front door appeared before me. The message was clear. I could leave if I truly wanted to, but the house would prefer I stay. The breathing grew stronger each night, and I realized with growing horror that I was beginning to breathe in sync with it. My lungs expanded as the walls expanded, contracted as they contracted. If I tried to resist, to breathe at my own pace, my chest tightened painfully. It was easier to surrender, to let the house set the rhythm. On the 7th night, I understood. The breathing wasn't the house. It was all the people who had lived here before. all the souls it had absorbed over its long existence. My great-aunt was here, her essence merged with the structure. Her parents, their parents, generations of family dating back to the house's construction. They weren't dead, exactly. They were transformed, incorporated, made part of something larger. The house needed a caretaker, someone to maintain its physical form while it maintained its metaphysical existence. In exchange, it offered immortality of a sort, not as an individual, but as part of a collective consciousness, embedded in wood and stone and brick. I write this on my phone, though I'm not sure why. The signal died days ago, and I doubt anyone will ever read it. Perhaps it's just habit, the last action of a drowning man. Or perhaps some part of me hopes to warn whoever comes next, though I know the house will choose its own air when the time comes. The breathing is starting again. I can feel it in my bones now, a resonance that bypasses my ears entirely. The walls are calling, inviting me to place my hands flat against their warm surface, to feel the pulse of all those who came before. Each night, I resist a little less. Each night, the boundary between my body and the house grows thinner. I understand now why my great-aunt's journals ended abruptly. There comes a point when words become unnecessary, when the distinction between self and structure dissolves. I'm approaching that threshold. My thoughts echo in the walls. My dreams play out in the shadows that dance across the ceilings. When I look in mirrors, I sometimes see faces that aren't quite mine, similar features arranged in unfamiliar patterns like architectural variations on a theme. The house is patient. It has waited over a century. It can wait a little longer. But I feel my resistance crumbling like old mortar. Soon I'll place my hands on the walls one final time and let myself sink into that warm, breathing darkness. I'll become another rhythm in the great respiratory symphony, another voice in the whispered chorus that fills the halls at night. And someday, years or decades hence, another relative will receive a yellowed letter about an unexpected inheritance. They'll drive through the forest to find this impossible house, and they'll think, as I did, that they're just investigating a property. But houses like this don't have owners. They have inhabitants, and eventually, they have components. Living pieces of a larger organism that exists between dimensions, breathing in and out, forever and ever, world without end. The walls are moving again. Faster tonight. Urgent. Hungry. I think I'll go touch them. Just for a moment. Just to feel that warmth, that connection to something vast and ancient and patient. Just to understand what it's like to be part of something greater than myself. Just to breathe along with the house, in perfect eternal synchronization. Just to... The entry ends here. But if you listen carefully on certain nights, when the wind is still and the moon is dark, you can hear it. That slow, deep breathing that seems to come from the earth itself. And if you're very unlucky, you might feel an inexplicable urge to follow that sound, to seek out a house that shouldn't exist, to place your palm against walls that pulse with impossible life. Because family calls to family, and the house must be fed. And it's always, always hungry. Story 13. The realtor's hands trembled as she handed my wife the keys. I should have noticed that tremor, should have paid attention to how quickly she backed away from the doorway, how she barely waited for us to step inside before rushing to her car. But I was too focused on keeping the moving boxes steady, too concerned about the rain that threatened to soak through the cardboard. My wife stood in the doorway, silhouetted against the gray afternoon light, one hand on her pregnant belly, the other gripping those old brass keys. The house breathed around us. That's the only way I can describe it. A subtle expansion and contraction of the walls, as if the structure itself were drawing air through invisible lungs. The floorboards groaned beneath our feet with a rhythm that seemed almost deliberate, almost conscious. My wife said it was just the old wood settling, adjusting to our weight and warmth after months of abandonment. She was always the practical one, finding logical explanations for things that made my skin crawl. We'd gotten the Victorian mansion for a fraction of its value. 5 bedrooms, 3 bathrooms, original hardwood throughout. and that distinctive turret room that my wife immediately claimed as her art studio. The previous owners had left in what the realtor delicately called unusual circumstances, abandoning most of their belongings. We found their clothes still hanging in closets, food rotting in the refrigerator, mail piling up in the foyer as if they'd simply vanished mid-routine. The attic door appeared on our third night. I know how that sounds. Doors don't just appear. But I'd walked past that section of hallway dozens of times during our first 2 days, and there had been nothing but smooth plaster wall beneath a particularly dark oil painting of a woman whose eyes seemed to track movement. Then, on that third night, as I made my way to the bathroom at 3 a.m., there it was. A narrow door, painted the same faded cream as the walls, with a crystal doorknob that caught the moonlight filtering through the hall window. My wife insisted it had always been there, that we'd simply overlooked it in the chaos of moving. She pointed out the worn spots on the floor where feet had obviously traveled for decades, the slight discoloration around the frame that suggested age. But I knew, with a certainty that sat cold in my stomach, that door had materialized while we slept. The attic stairs creaked with our ascent, each step releasing a different note, like some discordant musical scale. Dust motes danced in the beam of my flashlight, swirling in patterns that seemed too organized, too deliberate to be random air currents. My wife followed close behind, her breathing shallow and quick. The pregnancy made climbing stairs difficult, but her curiosity overwhelmed her caution. The attic stretched longer than the house itself should have allowed, disappearing into shadows that my flashlight couldn't penetrate. But what we could see stopped us both mid-step. Toys. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged on shelves that lined every wall from floor to ceiling. Not modern toys. These were antiques, some looking handcrafted, others bearing the marks of long-defunct toy companies. Porcelain dolls with real human hair stared out from behind glass cases. Tin soldiers stood in perfect formation across dusty battlefields. Music boxes sat with their lids open, as if frozen mid-melody. But it was the center of the room that made my wife gasp. There, arranged in a perfect circle, sat 5 distinct collections, each separated by what looked like salt lines on the floor. A rocking horse from perhaps the 1920s, its painted eyes somehow maintaining their shine. A collection of marbles in a leather pouch, each sphere containing swirls that seemed to move when you weren't looking directly at them. A ventriloquist dummy in a tiny tuxedo, its head turned at an angle that hurt to perceive. A dollhouse that was an exact replica of the house we now lived in, complete with tiny furniture and fingernail-sized portraits on the walls. And in the very center, a music box with a dancing figure that I couldn't quite make out. My eyes simply refused to focus on it properly. My wife reached for the dollhouse, and I almost grabbed her wrist to stop her. Almost. But the rational part of my mind, the part that insisted there were explanations for everything, held me back. Her fingers brushed the miniature front door, and somewhere in the house, our house, a door slammed shut. We laughed nervously, blamed the wind, though no windows were open. That night, I heard them moving, tiny footsteps above our bedroom, the distinctive clip-clop of a rocking horse on wooden floors, the tinny notes of a music box playing a melody I recognized but couldn't name. My wife slept through it, one hand protectively over her belly, but I lay awake listening to what sounded like a child's tea party being conducted directly above us. The clink of miniature china, whispered conversations and voices too soft to make out words, occasional giggling that made my teeth ache. By morning, I'd convinced myself it was mice. Old house, abandoned for months. Of course there were mice. But when I returned to the attic to set traps, the toys had been rearranged. The rocking horse faced a different direction. The marbles had spilled from their pouch, forming patterns on the floor that looked almost like letters. The ventriloquist dummy sat in a different corner entirely, and I could have sworn its eyes followed me as I moved through the space. My wife found the first photograph tucked inside the dollhouse, a sepia-toned image of a boy, perhaps 7 or 8, sitting on that same rocking horse. On the back, in spidery handwriting, Timothy, 1923 to 1930, scarlet fever. She found more over the following days, hidden throughout the attic like some morbid scavenger hunt. Elizabeth, 1945 to 1952, drowning. James, 1961 to 1968, fall from window. Amanda, 1974 to 1981, unexplained. Peter, 1989 to 1996, missing, presumed dead. 5 photographs, 5 collections of toys, 5 sets of dates that all ended in this house. My wife, ever practical, researched the names at the library. Everyone had indeed lived in our house. Everyone had died here, though the records were frustratingly vague about the circumstances. The newspaper clippings she found spoke of tragedies, of investigations that went nowhere, of families who left town shortly after losing their children. But what made my hands shake as I read them was the consistency. Every article mentioned the children's toys being found arranged in the attic, as if placed there with deliberate care. The toys grew bolder as autumn progressed. I'd find the tin soldiers arranged in different battle formations each morning. The marbles would roll across the attic floor at night, their paths audible through the ceiling. The ventriloquist dummy appeared in different rooms, never moving while watched, but always somewhere new when we looked again. My wife tried to rationalize it all. Temperature changes causing wood to shift, vibrations from passing trucks, our own forgetfulness about where we'd last seen things, but she couldn't explain the dollhouse. Each day, the tiny replica showed our exact movements from the day before. Miniature figures appeared in the rooms where we'd been. A tiny man at the kitchen table where I'd eaten breakfast. A small woman in the studio where my wife painted. We hadn't put them there. We hadn't even touched the dollhouse since that first night. Yet every morning there they were, frozen in moments we'd lived 24 hours ago. Then my wife found the 6th photograph. It was tucked under the music box in the center of the circle, the one my eyes still couldn't properly focus on. The image was modern, colored but faded, showing a girl around 6 years old. The date on the back was from just last year, and instead of a name, there was a question mark. My wife's hands shook as she showed it to me, and I saw her unconsciously touch her belly, where our unborn child grew. That night, the toys descended from the attic. I woke to find the tin soldiers arranged around our bed, their tiny rifles pointed inward. The marbles had rolled down the stairs and pooled outside our bedroom door like drops of solid water. The rocking horse stood in the nursery we'd been preparing, swaying slightly despite the absence of any breeze. And the ventriloquist dummy sat in my wife's studio, positioned in front of her latest painting, a landscape that she insisted she hadn't touched, though it now featured 5 small figures in the foreground that hadn't been there before. My wife packed our things while I stood guard, watching the toys that seemed to watch us back. She moved with determined efficiency, but I saw her hands trembling as she folded clothes, saw her glance repeatedly at the dollhouse I'd brought down from the attic. Inside it, the miniature versions of us were also packing, their tiny luggage already by the front door. We left that afternoon, not even waiting for the moving truck. As I loaded the last box into our car, I looked back at the house. In the attic window, that window I'd never been able to open, that seemed painted shut from decades of neglect. 5 small faces peered down at us. Not real faces, I told myself. Just the porcelain dolls, somehow moved to the window. Just toys. But as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a 6th face join them. Smaller than the others, less distinct, as if still forming, as if waiting. We lost the baby 2 weeks later. The doctors called it a miscarriage, said these things happen sometimes, that we shouldn't blame ourselves. But I knew. We both knew. The house had marked our child for its collection, had already prepared a space in that circle of toys. We'd escaped, but not unchanged, not unscathed. I still dream about that attic. In my nightmares, I climb those musical stairs again and again, finding new toys each time. Modern ones now, smartphones and tablets and gaming systems, each representing another child the house has claimed or will claim. Sometimes I see myself among them, transformed into painted tin or molded plastic, forever frozen in a moment of terror. My wife doesn't speak of it. She's pregnant again, and we've moved 3 states away. but I catch her sometimes, staring at nothing, her hand protectively over her belly. We don't buy toys anymore. Can't bear to have them in the house. And when I pass by antique shops or yard sales, when I see those old porcelain dolls or tin soldiers, I walk faster, keep my eyes ahead, pretend I don't hear what sounds like tiny footsteps following me home. The realtor called last month. The house has been sold again to another young family. She wanted to know if we'd left anything in the attic, said the new owners had found some personal belongings. I told her we'd left nothing. Told her to tell them to leave the attic locked. Told her, then begged her, to warn them about the toys. She laughed, said I was being dramatic, said the new family had 2 young children who were delighted by all the antiques they'd found up there. Said the children spent hours in that attic, playing with those wonderful old toys. I hung up and tried not to think about the dollhouse, about whether it now showed a new family's daily routines. Tried not to imagine 2 new photographs being tucked away among the collections. Tried not to wonder if the toys had already begun their nocturnal migrations. If tiny footsteps had started echoing through the walls. If those children had noticed how the playthings moved when no one was watching. But mostly, I try not to think about that 6th collection spot in the circle. Still empty, still waiting. Because sometimes, late at night when my wife is asleep and the house is quiet, I swear I can hear it calling, not my name. Never my name. But something worse. The name of the child we haven't had yet. The one my wife carries now. The one the house somehow already knows. The toys are patient. They've waited decades before. They can wait a little longer. Story 14. The realtor's key trembled in the lock, and I told myself it was just the October wind. But even then, standing on that wraparound porch with its peeling white paint and sagging floorboards, I knew better. The Victorian mansion loomed above us, its Gothic revival turrets piercing the gray afternoon sky like accusing fingers. My wife squeezed my hand, her excitement palpable, while I fought the inexplicable urge to turn around and drive back to our cramped apartment in the city. The previous owner was eccentric, the realtor admitted, her practiced smile faltering as she pushed open the heavy oak door. The hinges screamed in protest, a sound that seemed to echo through empty rooms beyond. But the price reflects the necessary renovations. Eccentric, that's what they called him in the paperwork. Not the truth. That old man Whitmore had been found crawling through the halls on his hands and knees, feeling his way like a blind man. Every mirror in the house reduced to glittering fragments on the floors. The neighbors had heard him screaming about faces, about things watching him from behind the glass. They'd found him eventually, alive but gone, his fingers bleeding from handling all that broken glass, his eyes wide and unseeing even though the doctor said nothing was physically wrong with them. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing on the hardwood floors. The entrance hall stretched before us, grand and imposing, with a sweeping staircase that curved up into shadow. Rectangles of unfaded wallpaper marked where mirrors had once hung, dozens of them, judging by the ghostly outlines. The realtor hurried us through, her heels clicking nervously, pointing out original fixtures and architectural details while carefully avoiding any mention of the obvious absence. My wife saw potential. She always did. Where I saw water stains spreading across the ceiling like blood pooling beneath skin, she saw character. Where I noticed the way shadows seemed to linger in corners despite the afternoon light, she saw ambiance. By the time we reached the master bedroom on the 2nd floor, she was already planning where our furniture would go. The master bathroom gave me pause. It was enormous, with a clawfoot tub and separate shower, but the medicine cabinet hung open, its mirrored door removed. Above the double sinks, more rectangular patches on the wall told the same story. Even the small decorative mirrors that might have adorned the space were gone, leaving behind tiny nail holes like puncture wounds in the plaster. "We'll need to replace all the mirrors," my wife said, running her fingers along the bare wall. How strange to remove them all. The realtor's laugh was too high, too quick. The estate sale handled most of the previous owner's belongings. But the house has such good bones, don't you think? Good bones. I thought about Whitmore's bones, probably brittle now in whatever institution they'd locked him away in. I thought about the bones of this house, the framework hidden behind these walls where he'd claimed to see things moving, shifting, watching. We moved in 3 weeks later. The first few days were a blur of unpacking and arranging, the constant activity keeping any unease at bay. My wife had ordered mirrors online, simple, modern ones to start, and I hung them myself, trying to ignore how my reflection seemed somehow off in each one, like looking at myself through water. Just the stress of the move, I told myself. Just the unfamiliar angles of a new space. It was the fourth night when I first noticed something wrong. I'd gotten up to use the bathroom, navigating by the hallway nightlight we'd installed. The new mirror above the sink caught my reflection as I washed my hands, and for just a moment, barely a heartbeat, I could have sworn my reflection moved independently. Just a fraction of a second's delay, like a live stream with a poor connection. I blinked hard, splashed cold water on my face, and when I looked again, everything was normal. But normal is a relative thing in a house like this. The next morning, while shaving, I kept catching movement in my peripheral vision. Each time I'd turn, there was nothing there, just my own reflection staring back at me from the medicine cabinet mirror. But the feeling persisted, a crawling sensation between my shoulder blades like eyes tracking my every move. I mentioned it to my wife, trying to keep my tone light, but she just laughed and blamed the old house settling. By the end of the first week, I'd started avoiding mirrors when possible. I'd brush my teeth while looking down, shave by touch, dress with my back to the bedroom mirror my wife had hung. She didn't notice, or if she did, she didn't mention it. She was too busy with her own project, researching the house's history at the local library and historical society. She came home one evening with a folder full of photocopied newspaper clippings and property records, her eyes bright with discovery. The house had been built in 1889 by a railroad magnate named Cornelius Ashford. He'd lived there with his family for only 3 years before abruptly selling and moving back east. The next owners lasted 5 years, then 2 years, then 18 months. The Whitmores had made it almost a decade before the old man's breakdown. "Look at this," she said, spreading out a grainy photograph from 1891. It showed the entrance hall, and where we now had blank walls, there had been an elaborate arrangement of mirrors. Not just one or two, but dozens, all different sizes and shapes, creating a kaleidoscope effect. The original owner had them specially installed. He called it the Gallery of Infinite Reflections. The name made my skin crawl. I studied the photograph, trying to make out details in the old image. The mirrors seemed to reflect into each other, creating a tunnel effect that made my eyes water to follow. And there, barely visible in one of the reflections, was that a figure, or just a smudge on the old photograph? Every owner added more mirrors, my wife continued, excited by her discovery. It became a tradition, until Whitmore destroyed them all. That night I dreamed of glass, endless panes of it, reflecting not my face but others, strangers with hollow eyes and mouths that moved soundlessly, pressing against the other side of the mirror, their hands leaving fog on glass that didn't exist. I woke to find myself standing in the bathroom, my hand raised toward the mirror above the sink. My reflection stared back at me, and for one terrifying moment, I wasn't sure which side of the glass I was on. The next few days blurred together in a haze of mounting unease. I'd catch glimpses of movement in every reflective surface. The microwave door, the window panes at night, even the surface of my coffee. My wife seemed unaffected, humming as she hung more mirrors she'd found at estate sales. Vintage ones with ornate frames that she said matched the house's period. "Don't you think we have enough mirrors?" I suggested one evening, watching her position a particularly large one in the hallway. She looked at me strangely. "We've barely replaced what was here before. Besides, they make the space feel bigger, don't they? More open." Open. That was one word for it. Another might be exposed. Or watched. I started working late at the office, delaying my return home. But eventually, I always had to go back. The house would be waiting, its windows glowing in the darkness like eyes. Inside, the mirrors multiplied our presence, creating an army of duplicates that moved when we moved, stopped when we stopped. Or did they? One night, 2 weeks after we'd moved in, I was brushing my teeth before bed when I noticed it again. That slight delay in my reflection. This time I didn't look away. I kept my eyes fixed on my mirror self, watching as I slowly raised my hand. My reflection raised its hand too, but a half-second behind. I lowered my hand. Again, the delay. Then my reflection smiled, even though I knew my own face remained expressionless. I stumbled backward, my hip hitting the counter hard enough to bruise. When I looked again, my reflection appeared normal, mimicking my shocked expression perfectly. But I could still see it, or thought I could, something in the eyes that wasn't quite right, a depth that shouldn't exist in a flat surface. I didn't tell my wife. How could I? Honey, I think my reflection is becoming autonomous wasn't exactly dinner conversation. Besides, she was so happy with the house, so pleased with how her vintage mirrors were transforming the spaces. I couldn't ruin that for her with what were clearly stress-induced hallucinations. But the next day, while she was at her book club, I covered all the mirrors with sheets. Just temporarily, I told myself. Just to prove that nothing was wrong, that it was all in my head. The house felt different immediately, quieter somehow, as if I'd muffled something that had been making noise just below the range of hearing. That night, I slept better than I had since we'd moved in. No dreams of glass and watching eyes. No midnight wanderings to stand before mirrors I couldn't remember approaching. Just peaceful, empty sleep. My wife pulled the sheets down the next morning, irritated. What is this about? Are we suddenly Orthodox Jews sitting Shiva? I couldn't explain the relief I'd felt with them covered, couldn't articulate the creeping dread that returned as she exposed each reflective surface. So I mumbled something about paint fumes and needing to protect them during renovations we weren't actually doing. She gave me a long look, and that's when I noticed it. Really noticed it. She'd been spending so much time with her mirrors, admiring them, adjusting them, cleaning them until they gleamed, and now, standing there in the morning light, I could see something different about her. It was subtle, barely perceptible, but her movement seemed somehow more fluid, more graceful, more like a reflection than a person. "Are you feeling all right?" I asked. She tilted her head, and for just a moment, the angle was wrong. Too far, too sharp, like she was mirroring someone else's movement. Never better. This house agrees with me. That phrase echoed in my head all day. The house agrees with me. Not I love the house or I'm happy here, but the house agrees with me. As if the house had opinions, as if it had preferences. I started researching Whitmore, digging deeper than the newspaper articles my wife had found. I discovered he'd been a collector before his breakdown, specifically, a collector of antique mirrors. He'd written letters to historical societies, claiming that old mirrors could hold images, that they were like photographic plates that never quite cleared. He'd theorized that every person who'd ever looked into an old mirror left something behind, a fragment of themselves trapped in the silver backing. His final letter, written 3 days before his breakdown, was barely coherent. He wrote about the mirrors showing him accumulated faces, about layers of watchers built up over decades. He claimed the mirrors in the house had become doorways, that things were coming through, not spirits exactly, but echoes that had gained substance through repetition and observation. The Historical Society had dismissed him as mentally ill, but sitting in my office, reading his words on my computer screen, while carefully avoiding my own reflection in the darkened window, I wondered if Whitmore had been the sanest person to ever live in that house. That evening, I came home to find my wife in the entrance hall, standing perfectly still in front of the largest mirror she'd installed. She wasn't moving, wasn't blinking, just staring at her reflection with an intensity that made my stomach clench. "Honey?" I called out. She didn't respond. I moved closer, and that's when I saw it. Her reflection wasn't mimicking her stillness. It was moving, gesturing, its mouth forming words I couldn't hear. My wife's eyes tracked the movements, hypnotized, and I realized with growing horror that she was the one copying the reflection, not the other way around. I grabbed her shoulder, spinning her away from the mirror. She blinked rapidly, confused, as if waking from a dream. What? I was just... I was... How long were you standing there? She frowned, glancing at her watch. I don't... It was just after lunch when I came to clean the mirror. But that was... Her face paled. That was 4 hours ago. We ate dinner in silence, both avoiding each other's eyes in the mirrors that surrounded us. Every reflective surface felt like a window now, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was peering through from the other side. My wife kept touching her face, as if reassuring herself it was still her own. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to the house settle around us, and beneath the normal creaks and groans, I heard something else. A soft sound, like whispers, coming from somewhere I couldn't identify. I got up to investigate, careful not to wake my wife, and followed the sound downstairs. In the entrance hall, the mirrors were dark, reflecting nothing but shadows. But the whispering was louder here, and as I stood in the center of the room, I realized it was coming from the mirrors themselves, not from behind them, from within them, as if the glass itself was speaking. I moved closer to the largest mirror, the one where my wife had stood entranced. My reflection materialized in the darkness, a pale shape that solidified as I approached, but something was wrong with it. It was me, but older, haggard, with eyes that held a depth of exhaustion I'd never seen in my own face. And behind that reflection, barely visible, was another. Me, but younger. And behind that, another figure that might have been me or might have been someone else entirely. Layers. Just like Whitmore had written, layers of watchers accumulated over time. I raised my hand to touch the glass, and my reflection, all my reflections, raised theirs in response. But just before my fingers made contact, I saw something else moving in the depths of the mirror. Not a reflection at all, but something using the reflections as camouflage, moving between them like a predator through tall grass. I jerked my hand back, but it was too late. The thing had seen me seeing it. All the mirrors in the room suddenly showed the same image. Not me, not the hall, but a place that existed only in the glass. A corridor of infinite reflections, each one slightly different, each one wrong in some fundamental way. And moving through that corridor, getting closer with each recursive image, was something that had once been human, but had spent too long on the wrong side of the mirror. It wore Whitmore's face, or what was left of it. I ran up the stairs into our bedroom, slamming the door behind me. My wife stirred but didn't wake. I spent the rest of the night sitting in the corner, watching the mirror on our dresser, waiting for Whitmore's fractured face to appear. But the mirror remained normal, showing only our darkened room and my terrified expression. The next morning, I tried to convince my wife we should leave. I told her about the whispers, about what I'd seen in the mirrors. She listened patiently, then suggested I was stressed from the move, that maybe I should talk to someone. Her tone was sympathetic, but her eyes kept drifting to the mirror behind me, and I couldn't tell if she was looking at her reflection or at something else. Days passed in a haze of paranoia. I covered mirrors when she wasn't looking, only to find them uncovered hours later. I avoided reflective surfaces, but they seemed to multiply. Every window at night, every polished surface, even standing water became suspect. And always, I felt watched. My wife grew distant, spending more time in front of her mirrors, having conversations with herself that stopped the moment I entered a room. Once, I heard her laughing at something her reflection had done, even though from my angle I could see she was alone. I researched ways to break whatever hold the house had on us. Salt circles, burning sage, prayers to any deity that might listen. Nothing worked. The mirrors remained windows to that other place, and the things behind them grew bolder. I'd see them now even in my peripheral vision. Shapes that shouldn't exist, movements that defied physics, faces that were almost but not quite human. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself drawn to the entrance hall. The mirrors were active, showing not reflections but scenes. Past owners of the house, all standing in this same spot, all staring into these same mirrors with the same expression of horrified fascination I felt on my own face. I saw Cornelius Ashford, the original owner, watching something emerge from the glass. I saw the family from the 1920s, their children playing a game with their reflections that ended in screams. I saw Whitmore, younger and still sane, hanging mirror after mirror, creating his gallery of infinite reflections. And I saw myself, or versions of myself, me from last week, terrified and confused, me from yesterday, resigned and hollow-eyed, me from tomorrow, or next week, or next month, standing calmly before the mirrors as if I belonged there, as if I'd always been there. That's when I understood. The house didn't just collect mirrors, it collected the people who looked into them. Every owner, every resident, eventually became part of the reflection, trapped between the glass and the silver backing, watching the next occupants with hungry eyes. I turned to run, to grab my wife and flee, but she was already there, standing at the top of the stairs. She descended slowly, her movements too smooth, too perfect. When she reached me, she smiled, and I saw that her eyes had taken on the silvered quality of old mirror glass. "Isn't it wonderful?" she said, her voice harmonizing with itself as if speaking from multiple places at once. "We're becoming part of the house's history. We're joining the gallery." I backed away, but she followed. And in every mirror, our reflections multiplied and diverged, showing possible futures and alternative presents. In some, I gave in, let the house take me, became another watcher in the glass. In others, I fought, smashed the mirrors, ended up like Whitmore, alive but broken, seeing faces everywhere, never sure which side of the reflection was real. "Look," my wife said, gesturing to the largest mirror. "Look at what we can become." I looked and saw myself, not reflected, but refracted into 1,000 possibilities. Each one was me, but more, enhanced by the accumulated watchers, improved by their collective gaze. It would be so easy to step through, to join them, to stop fighting the inevitable. But then I saw Whitmore's face again, pressed against the inside of the glass, his mouth forming a single word: "Run." So I ran. Out of the house into the night, leaving my wife standing in her gallery of infinite reflections. I drove until dawn, checked into a motel, and avoided every mirror I encountered. But it didn't matter. I could feel them still. The watchers, the reflected ones, the things that lived between glass and silver. They were in every reflective surface now, following me, waiting. I tried to go back once, to get my wife. The house was dark, empty-looking from the outside. But I could see them in the windows, dozens of figures, all standing perfectly still, all watching. My wife was among them, I think, though it was hard to tell. They all looked the same from a distance, like reflections of reflections, endlessly recursive. I've stopped looking in mirrors altogether now. I shave by touch, dress in darkness, avoid any surface that might show me my own face. Because I know what I'll see if I look, not myself, but the space I left behind in that house, the reflection that stayed when I fled. It's still there, in the gallery, waiting for me to return and reclaim it. Or perhaps it's waiting to reclaim me. Sometimes late at night, I wonder if I ever really left. Maybe I'm still standing in that entrance hall, staring into the mirrors, and everything since then has been just another reflection, another possible future playing out in the glass. Maybe the real me is trapped there, watching this version of myself type these words, trying to warn whoever will listen. Don't trust mirrors. They remember everything they've seen, and sometimes they want to see more. The house still stands, I'm told. New owners move in occasionally, drawn by the low price and the Victorian charm. They always comment on the lack of mirrors, always promise to restore the house to its former glory. They never last long. And somewhere, in the space between reflection and reality, Whitmore laughs, or maybe cries. In that place, they're the same thing anyway. Just another distortion in the glass. Another face that isn't quite your own. watching from the other side of every mirror you'll ever look into. Even now, writing this on my laptop, I can see something wrong in the black screen's reflection whenever it dims. A shape behind me that shouldn't be there. A face that might be mine or might be something else entirely, waiting patiently for me to look closer, to finally see what I've been avoiding all these months. I won't look. I can't. But I know one day I will. The mirrors are patient. They've collected faces for over a century. They can wait a little longer. They always do.